zoom.us or whatever. Click there,
okay.
and under there on preferences, I'll tell you guys another thing I found out. Check this out. Go to video, and if you go down, look at my video, you can put touch up my appearance. And it like
Ah.
filter on you. I had no idea of any of these things until right before this call. So I'm just letting you guys know that those are where those things are all found on this.
Yeah, I'm yet to find that Zoom US. I guess for next time.
It's right at the top wherever the actual app is. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes command comma will bring up the preferences too.
Hi, Sheila.
Yes.
You have mail.
Fred, sorry.
You have mail.
Okay.
So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 32nd edition of Ifakara Masterclasses. We will be starting in approximately 1 minute. And we are super excited today to have 3 experts working on not just research, but implementation as well. Malaria control is the subject still. And my colleague Shayla and myself are, as always, excited to host you all. We faced a little challenge in the past week, sending out the notification. So it's possible that not everybody received the notification. But let's hope that they will eventually, if interested, see the class, because we are streaming it live on YouTube already. And I will request my colleagues from Ifakara to kindly share the YouTube link on the chat, just so that anybody who wants to share with friends. As always, our guests need no introduction. It's funny that in these masterclasses, we never introduce our guests. I think that is because we have been lucky so far to have people who are already very well known. So. Shall are we good to go?
Yes.
Okay, so why don't I just load the event, then we can begin. I would like to also announce that the 33rd edition of the masterclass will take place next week. This is on the 28th, and it will be delivered by Professor Toon Bozema and Chris Druckley. So just do that. I seem to be facing a challenge here. For some reason, I don't understand, but. Hey, Sheila.
Yes, Fred.
There seems to be a bug on my end. If you don't mind, I'm just gonna get this restarted in just one moment, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Um,
Is it that you can't share? I could share.
it's that my computer isn't acting up at all, except my voice can go through. So
So I could share my screen.
I think we are good now. Just a moment. Yeah, let me see if my screen is shareable. Is it visible now?
It's coming through. Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Apologies, colleagues, for the situation. So as I was saying, the 33rd edition of this masterclass will be delivered next week by Professor Chris Druckley and Tune Buzima. Chris is from London School and Tune Buzima is from Radboud in the Netherlands. And we will be talking a lot about asymptomatic malarias, their importance, how do we deal with it. The title of the masterclass will be The Invisible Parasitemia. So that's just for next week, and please look out for the invitation. Will go out today. We are very grateful to our partners, Ingeborg van Schaik at Malaria World, who helps a lot with the circulation, Konstantina Butitske at Swiss PH, Fiona Shenton at Bova, and our colleagues at MESA, the Malaria Eradication Scientific Alliance. They have been very, very helpful, sending out the notifications and supporting this masterclass. Thank you all very much. We kindly ask everybody to mute their microphones and their videos. There will be just the speakers and then the hosts whose videos will be up for today. So in another 2 seconds or 10 seconds, we will be starting this. Good. Sheila, shall we start? Cool. Thank you so much, colleagues. Today, the masterclass will be delivered by Josh Yukich, Hannah Koenker, and Marcy Erskine. I believe you can see all of them on the line. The discussion will cover course coverage of malaria control, and there's a range of indicative topics. We try as much as possible to cover as many of these as possible. Depending on timing, some of the questions may remain unanswered. We are encouraging the experts in the room to activate their chat function and to contribute as always. The indicative topics that we look forward to discussing with you today include costs and cost effectiveness of different malaria control interventions. We will be using a lot the examples of ITNs, but we hope that this knowledge transfer can go beyond just ITNs. We will be talking about universal coverage. What does it really mean? How do we measure it? We will discuss a little bit about gaps in access and duration of protection that you get from the different interventions, importance of human behaviors, social and behavior change communication. How do you address these issues? We have Anna with us here, who is a super expert in this subject, and we're looking forward to having a discussion around that. And we were hoping to talk a little bit about surveillance. Because of time, we will cut that off today, but instead we will try and discuss what happens next. How do we move away from the one-size-fits-all approach, and how do we use local data to inform local decisions? And finally, hopefully, our colleagues, our experts here will be available to provide a little bit of information about their personal experiences so that the participants in the masterclass could benefit from that. At this stage, I bring it back to my colleague Sheila to get us going.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. To start us off, I think it's all obvious to us that the Alliance for Malaria Prevention really is one of the organizations that helps to ensure that bed nets are distributed in a sufficient and optimal manner. So a question to you, Mercy, please share with us what the role of AMP is. I just recently subscribed to the emails that are sent by AMP. They hold, I mean, you guys hold meetings every week. I think that's massive responsibility, and provide updates on bednet distribution. So Mercy, please just briefly let us know, or tell us about what the role of AMP is.
Thanks, Sheila. So AMP, and actually Hannah is a core group member on AMP as well. So she's been with us on this group from the beginning almost. AMP is really an alliance of different partners from the country to the global level. And we focus on three main areas. So one is really the coordination of partners. So what you referred to, the weekly meetings where we pull people together. We also have thematic groups, our emerging issues, our innovation and evaluation group, our continuous distribution group. So we try to pull together different program people and experts in their field and people who are interested around that coordination around ITN scale up and continuous distribution. The second piece is really on operational guidance. And I'm sure you saw, we put out a lot of guidance around how do we adapt to COVID now? Like, how do we get nets out safely? So the operational guidance is a major part of what we do. And then the third piece is really the technical assistance. And we base that on country requests. So lots of countries don't need technical assistance. And that's the ultimate objective is that we don't even need to provide TA. But right now there are some countries that are still adopting new approaches. COVID adaptations were a big lift. And so a big part of our work is really on that technical assistance. And the last thing I think I would say we're really working on tracking campaigns around the world. And we really focused on that a lot last year. With the COVID epidemic, we weren't sure how we would proceed and how we would do. And so it was important for us to identify those bottlenecks and be able to flag those to leadership positions that could take action on where we were seeing challenges. So I think that would, in a nutshell, I'd summarize AMP as that, but invite Hannah to add anything else she'd like to mention.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the folks on the call might be familiar with AMP. And for those that aren't, the weekly calls are a really great place to get more information on what campaigns are going on and in particular the implementation and the nuts and bolts of the campaigns and how they are rolled out and where and what those challenges are and what the recommendations are for how we deal with those challenges. So yeah, just inviting anybody who's interested or working on implementation of mass campaigns or continuous distribution of ITNs to join the group and get the updates.
One of the things that you guys do very well is tracking bednet distribution in countries. Here is a screenshot with the example from Tanzania. I think the data you have on your online at the moment is updated to 2021. I think for Tanzania, though, the data is up to 2017. But talk to us a little bit about how this data is, first of all, how important this is, and how you use this information to inform activities of AMP and of the countries.
Sure. So this is work that's really led by John Milner, who's the focal point for the net mapping project. And what John does is he works directly with suppliers and has done now for a very long time. So I think it's probably the most complete historical database we have of ITNs that have been shipped to countries since 2004. And as you know, you can slide that those years and you can kind of see what happened. So John really works with the manufacturers, and what this data represents is really ITNs that have been shipped. So the manufacturers will get orders, and then when the nets are manufactured and ready to go, they send that data to John. And what John does is he puts out a quarterly report. So the data is updated every quarter, and then it's updated annually. So we can see across sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the whole world, where are we at with ITNs being delivered to countries. I think what was important about this again, and I think, last year I thought national programs were incredibly successful and their partners in getting nets out. I think we're starting to see more of the supply chain disruptions coming this year, because last year's campaigns, of course, ITNs were procured in 2019. And so now we're starting to see that. And I think this data that John collects will help us to see, where we should have been and where we were a year ago. We're actually much lower quantities going out, which should never be the case, right? And that'll be a lot due to, manufacturing challenges, no containers, supply chain disruptions. So I think John's data will really allow us to track those disruptions moving forward. Over.
Here's an example from, thanks a lot, Mercy, for that. This data is actually very rich. It's not just complete the way you say, but it's also quite rich. I've only just, started interacting with it. And, if this is an example from Tanzania, that is the supplies you see of population at risk. You see a little bit of information there on the types of bed nets. I guess the question for us here is this information that people are willing to share? I see there, for example, we have the PBO nets already starting to show, and quite good that we have that. Is this information that manufacturers or countries are willing to provide easily?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. So the manufacturing data, yes, we can get that. John has really worked hard to establish confidential arrangements with each of the manufacturers. So when you see that data come, you don't see individual supplier data, right? Or you don't see like what brand of PBO is coming out. You just see that it's a PBO, or you see that it's a dual active ingredient net. So that's something that John has been very, very careful about. The question on accessing data on the other end, I think, is the more important question, Fredros. So John would really love to link, and what he's tried to do here with the Tanzania data, he'd like to link the in-country distribution data with the procurement data, right? So the shipped out and then what was distributed. That in-country distribution data is very, very difficult to access. It's sensitive data. It's used for reporting. A couple of different numbers given to different donors can lead to pretty serious effects at times. And so that in-country distribution data, I think, is really, really hard to get. It's getting easier with digital tools. I think people are feeling more comfortable to share when they're using digital tools. But, paper-based data, I think we all understand where we are with that. I mean, it's a challenge. You've got thousands of people collecting data and trying to pull all that together and make sure you get to the right number. And I don't necessarily think that's that easy. And I'd ask Hannah to really kind of talk a little bit more on that point, because I know she's been trying to collect some of that data as well. Over.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add, the in-country distribution data, for those that are immersed in how the distributions are done, none of this is a surprise, but it can be a little confusing for those at the higher levels when you have, the shipment data of the nets going in, that's one number, large, lot of nets going into the country. Then there's delivery down to, say, the district level, and the number of nets that are delivered to the district. That's yet another level of information that's going to have a certain total as it totals up. From there, as the nets are then moved out to the distribution points, the individual health facilities or what have you, you'll have a number of nets delivered to those distribution points. You're at the point now where you're breaking bales into different quantities, and you may have some discrepancies just as a result of that, or because people are making simple math errors or whatever. And then you have the number of nets that are actually picked up at the distribution point, and given redemption rates and human behaviors and the popularity of the particular net or the weather on a certain day or whatever, you're going to have a number of nets distributed that may be lower, hopefully not higher than the number of nets that are available there. Yeah. And then which of those gets put into the database and how that's taken up can be, the result of, or can lead to some of these discrepancies. And then, as Marcy noted, anytime there's a discrepancy, people will kind of jump onto that, but understanding the context in which we're trying to manage these distributions. Sometimes there's leftover nets, and then there's leftover nets. What happens to them? Do they get worked back into the system? Do they eventually get distributed? Can you assume that they've been distributed? These are all questions that the data analysts have to kind of answer as they're managing these types of visualizations. Over.
And Fredos, just to pick back
Excellent.
up, and you head
Yeah.
back to the tracker, you know, the ITN campaign tracker. When we're tracking now, this is a decision we're trying to look at. We can't get the in-country data, but, you know, we need to feed into like how many nets did go out this year. Right now, we're making an assumption that if you procured 12 million nets for your campaign and you completed your campaign, 12 million nets went out. We know that's not actually the case. So we might need to think forward on, do we adjust that number? Do we say that it's 10% less? Do we say that's 15% less? And I don't know where that number kind of comes from, but making the assumption that 100% of what was planned went out, I think it's an erroneous assumption. And we know we're making that assumption from the beginning. Over.
Yeah, I mean, all data sources have weaknesses here and there. And I'm just saying that I haven't seen myself anything more comprehensive than this. But do you guys think that this could be used for projections for, you know, planning purposes?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I think where countries are comfortable and have, you know, confidence in their data to be able to share it in this manner, this is the type of data that's extremely useful for projecting coverage in the current time frame, and also understanding the ways that net distributions lead into ITN, convert into ITN access
Right.
based on net durability and everything else. So yeah, I know, you know, a lot of researchers, and Josh can also comment on this, who are desperate to have, you know, this type of low level, district level, subnational level ITN distribution data in order to inform models of impact and transmission.
Right. My last question on this, and then I'll hand it back to my colleague Shayla. I've seen you tracking also, you know, different types of bed nets here. You have the new AI nets and the PBO nets. It's still a small quantity overall, but is there already any indication about the uptake of these kinds of nets by countries?
So, I mean, I'll start on the procurement side and then maybe hand over to Hannah on to finish up from there. But, you know, yeah, for sure. And as you said, this data is super rich. And I attended a meeting yesterday for the New Nets project, which is, you know, supporting the deployment of the new dual AI ITNs. And there'd been a reanalysis of this data that was done and presented. And it really showed the growth in the market of PBOs over the last little bit. And then as well, the dual AI nets, but without a WHO recommendation, we're not going to see that market grow significantly, right? Because it's not your choice right now to actually buy those nets. So, but the PBO market over time, the shift is significant. And I think we'll continue to see that movement moving forward. But Hannah will pick up on from there onto the other end of that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think uptake at the household level is always something that we want to monitor in the ITN distributions. If there's discrepancies in the redemption rates for particular types of nets, that's certainly something we want to be aware of. I think at ASTMH, New Nets Project will be presenting a little bit of data that they have from the first year-ish plus of data. Excuse me. Particularly for the anthropological component of the study and reactions to the new nets that have gone out, and then some findings from the cross-sectional and durability studies that are also going on for these nets. PMI also, of course, is doing a lot of work with PBO nets and everything else. So there may be experts on the call who could comment on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as Anna said, in case we have experts on any of these subjects that we're discussing today on the call, reach out to us and let us know if you're willing to come in and contribute. Of course, we have time limitations, but we try as much as possible to engage different opinions so we can foster learning. A major objective of this masterclass is really to encourage technical discourses around these specific subjects, largely apolitical, and for good reason, focusing on the key issues, really, so that people can learn as much of the technical detail as possible. Shayla, please.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. And thank you, Jenny Miller. I see you're kindly inviting us to join the Continuous Distribution Working Group. Yeah, just a reminder to the participants to look at the chat box. She has shared an email, and I think I would be eager to join this as well. So back to this, Hannah, looking at or thinking about such countries such as Mozambique, huge countries with a number of challenges in terms of vector control. And when you're thinking about having a successful mass campaign, or thinking about just the process of distribution of bed nets through a mass campaign, what are some of the factors that really are involved or would be taken into account to ensure the success of such campaigns?
Right. So yeah, that's a question for Marcy, I think, primarily, but I'll start and then kick over. I mean, I think the work that we've done under the Networks and Vectorworks projects, and the main thing that we found in terms of determining a successful outcome was having a good registration process. So if you can't find the households in the first stage and get them a coupon or a wristband or whatever it is, so that they can pick up a net, or if you're not reaching them door to door thoroughly, then your campaign is not going to be successful. Just like with vaccination campaigns and NTD campaigns, if you can't find them, then you can't deliver the intervention. But there's a lot of other really important aspects for campaign planning and success, and I will maybe let Marcy discuss those. She could do that for months.
Marcy, you actually,
Marcy, please go ahead.
Marcy, you did co-author this paper, actually, if I'm not wrong. Is that right?
Hannah and I were actually just WhatsApping trying to figure out whose paper that was.
I think
I was like, oh, no, it's yours.
So, yeah, go ahead. What does it take to do this?
So, I mean, first of all, I think the most important thing that it takes, and just to start from there, I think it takes, the commitment and the willingness of the national programs. I mean, these campaigns are not an easy lift, right? It's all hands on deck. And so I think, good leadership within the national programs, ability to delegate, making sure that there are teams focused on the campaign, and that the normal activities that have to happen every single day for our national program continue to happen, right? So we don't disrupt the whole thing. So just to start from there, I think, we won't have a successful campaign if we don't have that buy-in right from the beginning and that kind of engagement level of coordination. From there, I think, as Hannah said, I could talk about this for days. But I think, I'll start with, I think, strategy defining. We need to be really clear on strategies. And, I just reviewed some manuals, some plans for some countries. And one of the things we're seeing, we're not differentiating effectively urban and rural, and we're trying to apply what we do in rural as though it's going to work in urban. And so I think the initial thinking around those strategies, because if you don't get that right, cost it right, have the right number of people to implement it, then we're going to have a problem later. And then the second phase, of course, which is my favorite thing in the world, microplanning. So I really feel that bottom-up process where you get information from the community health facility level, where you do that effectively, I think every campaign will succeed. Where you cut on that activity, I feel like, you're basically setting yourself up for failure to not do your detailed planning, because you're not going to have effective use of your resources. So to cut at microplanning, you're basically going to have a knock-on effect for the whole rest of the campaign. So that's what I would flag right off. I mean, as I said, I could talk about that for days and all the other factors, but those are the two big things I would flag right now. The third one, and just linked to what Hannah said on the household registration, even where we have digital tools, even where we're improving on lots of things, we still have a lot of systemic issues. And some of those issues are, we have existing networks of CHWs, and then a campaign comes along and we don't use them, right? We decide it has to be somebody else. And some of those decisions aren't taken on the basis of capacity and ability to make sure that we achieve our programmatic outcomes. They're on the basis of politics or who knows who. And those systemic weaknesses, it doesn't change. The machine will still calculate that 8 divided by 2 gives you 4. But if I put 10 in first instead of 8, we still have the same problem of inflation. And so we have to get back to the basics of getting the right people to do things, defining households correctly, making sure the supervision works. So I think, there's a lot of factors that are systemic and are not at anybody's power except for the people who are doing those activities. So it's not something we can fix from our level, but it's really country and subnational and down to community level to figure out some of those challenges. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Marcy. I think we will deep dive around questions on costing of the bed nets and quantification later. But maybe just a few minutes or a few seconds to elaborate on what you mean by microplanning. Marcy, please.
Yeah, so when we build a strategy and a plan for a campaign, we build it based on some hypotheses at the central level, right? We figure, we can do 25 households per day for 10 days, and that's our assumption for everywhere. but without going down to the community level and actually mapping those communities, and then finding out that actually we only need 5 days and we're only going to be able to do 15 households a day because all these households are really far apart and it's going to take a lot of travel time. So it's where you take those hypotheses and you try to ground truth them and you adjust what you're planning based on the inputs of the people who are actually going to have to deliver those services, not on the inputs of people who are sitting at the capital level and who have to develop a nice plan and submit it. The operationalization of that really relies on a micro plan that's developed by a community with a community and reflects what the needs are and the actual access issues, barriers, facilitators, all of those different elements that come into people being engaged and participating in the activity at the end. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Marcy. Back to you, Fred.
Yeah, it's really just nice hearing this, and I guess Marcy makes a great point there about just how much work it is, and like for me, credit really back to the NMCPs and the teams on the ground, pulling off a massive campaign like this so frequently, and it's something that you don't do once. You do it frequently. I know that in some of the discussions I've been. It can an issue such as transportation for these massive bales of nets can be a big issue in some of the countries. So to pull these off to distribute like 20 million, some countries are distributing much more than 16 at a time. 30 million nets and so on. It's a difficult thing.
And I just wanted to jump in on the cost thing. And I mean, it's something Josh and I have been talking about, and Hannah a little bit too, but, and I'm sure national programs on this call will jump in on this very quickly, but, the economies have changed in countries. And so I think a big factor is also motivation. And in some countries, those unit costs that have been used for more than a decade haven't changed, and they're not reflective of the reality of what people have to live with. And so, it's uncomfortable when you're in a country and you're looking at those rates and you're like, wow, we have to do like an adjustment here because this is below the poverty line now. And I think these are things that, it's not very motivating to people to go out and door to door, carry bales of nets and get paid for $2 a day. I think we have to be realistic. If you want quality, you have to pay for that. And so I think, Josh and I were talking a little bit about doing some work around that. So I'd maybe hand to him on that. Over.
Yeah. Josh, do you want to comment on that briefly now? And of course, just for your information, we do have a number of questions on actual costing of these things, but Josh, go ahead, please.
Sure. No, I mean, I think Marcy's exactly right. I mean, we can't treat cost information and budgeting information as if it's static. Things change sometimes very rapidly with inflation and other changes in countries, and we have to be sensitive to that. And I think it's really easy to miss that and think that we answer the question once or something, and then we've got a tool that will, without changes, go on forever. But and so fully support that. And I think we do need to rethink through some of those things and redo that work over time. The other thing I was going to say about these successful campaigns too, is just to take it from the sort of nitty gritty picture that Marcy and Hannah are giving to the bigger picture of it too, is that success in terms of malaria control, I think we needed a couple of things on a big picture to make these campaigns work. And one was just getting enough money in the world spent on this thing, to put enough nets out there. And the other part was really understanding how nets interact. And Hannah's done so much work on this inside houses, in families, when people are using them, and to know how to distribute nets to houses, how many to put in houses, how frequently to get them to people so that you get enough people using them that you really make a big malaria control impact. And so I think part of the success is not only this kind of figuring out how to make it work on the ground with microplanning and enumeration and all those things, but really getting the kind of big picture understanding of it and just raising enough money. I mean, we need money in malaria control, and this is one of the great successes of having raised a lot, actually.
Do you guys think, I mean, there was in the past year a number of concerns that the COVID-19 situation would slow down the ITN distribution, and also other malaria programs, including treatment, vector control, case management, and the rest. Is there any indication? This is a paper from last year by Imperial Group, Oxford Group, a number of people involved here. Has there been any indication that these projections are coming true based on your activities, either Anna, Josh, or Marcy?
I can start it here and then maybe Hannah will want to pick up. So as I mentioned earlier, last year there was, as you all know, WHO set up the WHO Malaria COVID-19 sort of emergency structure. And within that, we had one that was under commodities and supply for IRS and ITNs. So we did track globally all of the campaigns planned for 2020 from the start of the pandemic, and we monitored that all the way through. We also tracked where things went off track and why. So meaning like if you got part of your campaign done and not the rest. From my perspective, and from a person who thought at the beginning of COVID, we were all going to go on vacation for a year and nets were going to stay in their warehouses and I was going to have a great year off. I feel super proud of the work of national programs and the partners all across the world on last year. I think, we planned around 225 million nets. It was our biggest campaign year in the 3-year cycle. So COVID hitting in 2020 versus 2021, 2021 would have been a much less significant impact on our work. Out of those 225, I think about 170 million, just over 170 million went out across 26 countries. I thought countries did extremely well. So we missed about 47 million nets for different reasons. That could have been delays on import. It may not have even been an in-country delay. Some of the PPE delays, right? Because that all had to be done quite quickly to get PPE in place. From my perspective, I thought that all went quite well. On the continuous distribution side, I don't see my colleague Mary on the line. She had done some work to interview programs to see what had happened with data in that time comparing 2019, 2020, just on a small scale in a few countries. We did see some impacts there, and Janie may want to jump in on that as well. But definitely on the campaigns, I think there was more of a push to get those big quantities of nets out, and maybe the routine and more continuous distribution systems might have been affected a little bit more. I think there was so much advocacy and pressure from WHO partners, governments to get those nets out to make sure that we didn't overburden health facilities, none of which came into play, of course, in many countries, but still, I think there was a big push, and I think that the countries rose to that challenge. Over.
That's wonderful to hear. That's great to hear. I mean, from the projections as in the published paper that we are displaying here, of course they are working with worst case scenarios, but in some places you expect a doubling of the impact. So double the number of deaths. So to hear you say that such impact might have been very minimal is welcome news. And in case there's anybody on the call with local knowledge of how this played out in any specific country, please let us know so you can jump in. Jenny, did you want to make a comment on that?
Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks. I just put into the chat that, for example, we had 2 school-based distributions in Tanzania and Ghana that were delayed because schools were closed in one case. So that happened, but in the end, the distributions both occurred of over it was 1.1 million nets in Ghana and about 2.4 in Tanzania. So it was positive in the end. Thanks.
Excellent. Let's move on. We're going to move on to an interesting topic. We don't usually get to discuss this a lot, but I would like us to talk about, we wanted to do a masterclass on social sciences for a while. We haven't been able to. Hopefully we will at some point, but we have we would like to have a small discussion with you, Anna, in particular, and of course, anyone else, on the role of behavior change communication. So, as a public health student, I was, informed, or rather taught, that it can take many years before people actually change their behavior. And I know that there are still many people, for example, who don't go to the hospital when they are ill. They would rather see like a traditional healer or something like that. So there are many aspects to this. Talk to us a little bit, and you've written quite a lot about that. This is one one of your articles on this subject where you've described how important behavior change communication is in malaria control. And very generally, talk to us about how this plays out for the major interventions in malaria, diagnostics, bed nets, treatments. So you can focus on any of them, maybe bed nets as you wish, but just to describe how important a behavior change communication is. And I noticed that in more recent lexicon, it's called social, some SBCC instead of BCC. So
Yeah.
you can educate us.
Yeah, everything is ephemeral. Larry. So yeah, this is an oldie but a goodie, and I think we do call it social behavior change now, mainly to convey that there's a lot of other things going on in behavior change other than just communication. So it's not, communication is not an intervention that works by itself. You can't just talk to somebody and then expect them to take action just because of that. Obviously, people are living in a certain context. They have a certain lived experience. They have expectations and social norms that are placed on them for how they act and when they seek treatment and what is serious and what is not. They have a risk perception about malaria that will inform their decisions to seek care for their child versus themselves, to seek care in the dry season versus in the wet season. And people are trying always to make the best decisions that they can under the circumstances and the constraints that they're under. And I think one of the things that I've tried to focus on throughout the research that I've done is to try and describe some of those constraints so that they're a little bit more apparent. Things that you can hear, when you're visiting a health facility at a medium-sized village, is that, oh, women don't come for IPTP because they're lazy. And it always makes me really mad because it's not like laziness is just a euphemism or a stand-in term or something to kind of convey all of the other constraints that the woman in question is under, right? Does she have money enough to get to the health facility? Does she have time enough with the other responsibilities of her household to get to the health facility? Does she live, with a person who is putting restrictions on her movement, and that means she can't come to the health facility? All of these things are happening, but it's, there's so many that it's too hard to list them. And so you end up with, oh, they're not coming because they're lazy. Behavior change, communication, behavior change interventions can, if they're well designed, try to act on many different aspects of that context around the person who is the target audience. Social norms can be influenced by radio and TV campaigns. Interpersonal communication is a great way to kind of meet people where they are and answer their questions, as we're seeing around the world with vaccine hesitancy for COVID and other interventions. And so the right set of tools, I think, in the right place, informed by the context that people are living in, and that includes, pre-testing to make sure those messages and the approaches are resonating with people. Those are really important in helping us improve everybody's ability to access the interventions and the healthcare systems that we would like them to access. This is something I can talk for months about.
So maybe
yeah.
to narrow it down. So
yeah,
when you guys go out there to make a response, to improve to kind of inspire certain behavior, you tackle this from different levels, individuals, communities and all that. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. There's the social ecological model, which is really helpful in kind of framing who we're trying to target and why and what their influence is, right? So there's the individual themselves who we can try and reach. There's also the people immediately surrounding them that have an influence on their behavior or that have some control or influence or recommendations for their behavior. So their immediate family, their peers, their friends. Then, in the community circle, there's the services that are there, the providers and their behaviors and attitudes and their willingness to, assist and talk to people versus, the pressures that they're under to move clients through the system or the resources that they have that prevent them, or the lack of resources that they have that prevent them from doing a quote unquote good job. So that community aspect is really important, not only for the systems and services that are there, but also additional social norms and the influence on health-seeking behavior. And then sort of in this outer area, we have the enabling environment, or the sort of structural system that we have. So what is the healthcare system? What are the resources at the governmental level that are being put towards these health activities and interventions? What tools do we have available for vector control in a particular place? All of that underpins the decisions that are available to be made by the community level and the interpersonal level and the individual level.
Yeah, Hannah, just to follow up on that, when thinking about the differences between the risk, the perceived risk in the control countries and in the pre-elimination or elimination countries, what are some of the ways in which behavioral change or IECBCC starts to change when you're looking at the pre-elimination countries? What sort of differences are you seeing there?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of people that have done a lot of great work on here, and obviously April is on the call as well. And you guys have a really nice paper out this week on many of these same issues. So, I think in pre-elimination, the risk is lower, right? So you're moving from malaria having been a top of mind health concern, and now starting to fade away and fade in relative importance to many other health concerns. Does that do the behaviors of seeking care for fever and using a bed net, if that's still part of the vector control arsenal in that particular area, are those behaviors ingrained enough, and have they been formed as habits sufficiently to continue despite the lower risk? I think that's one of the questions that a lot of pre-elimination countries and settings are facing. Does it make more sense in those settings to use a little bit more passive from the individual side tool like IRS, where as long as you're not replastering your walls or changing your walls, that intervention should be effective for a while, and you don't kind of have to think about it.
So they don't have to feel like that they have to, if you're not being beaten, you're probably less likely to use a bed net. So
yes,
maybe a more passive, a less active tool would be better.
Right. Yeah. And if there are other reasons to use nets, like I get a better sleep because there are other things biting me, or there are lizards or whatever prevents the cat in the house from bothering me in the middle of the night, or I just feel safer because I've used it for so long, even though the mosquitoes that are around maybe aren't carrying malaria to the same degree as they were before, this still feels secure to me. And I think behavior change activities can help to promote those kinds of the non-malaria benefits of bed nets, for example, and certainly would be needed for additional interventions in order to continue uptake of those, as we have spatial repellents that go forward, or ATSBs, or the other new vector control tools. We need to keep in mind as we move towards pre-elimination settings, what are going to be the behavioral triggers to keep using those even when the malaria risk itself has been reduced further.
Yeah, Hannah, just a follow-up question. When thinking about the suitability of the net itself, given the different types of sleeping areas, and I was discussing this with Fred earlier, and I actually remembered, Fred, that when I moved to Tanzania and we were living in Dar es Salaam as a student, I didn't buy a bed first. I bought a mattress. So that meant that sort of changed how the bed net would be used. But that's another story, a story for another day. So Hannah, what are some of the cases you're seeing, or factors you're seeing, or issues around the suitability of bed nets, given the different sleeping spaces that are there within the communities? Is this an issue at all?
Yeah, so, obviously everybody has a setup in their house or in where they're sleeping And the bed nets that we distribute may or may not be perfectly aligned or more aligned or less aligned with what the people might prefer to have in an ideal situation. On the other hand, people are generally quite motivated to use a net and will figure out a way to make that happen if they feel like that's a benefit for them. And so, you know, while we have many examples of people saying, oh, I can't use this net because it's rectangular and my whatever, I prefer conical. When we look at the data about net use from many different countries and many different surveys across many different years, it tends to tell the same story over time, which is the majority of people who have a net are using it. When they complain about nets not fitting their lifestyle or their immediate surroundings, I think we need to keep that in mind. We also need to consider the financial costs of trying to provide a public good to people that fits exactly what they need or what they say they need at this particular time. And we have to do the best that we can. So people who are motivated to use a net, I have this picture that I love using from Senegal, Oulé Bay in Senegal shared this with me. And it's a truck driver. His truck is parked outside. The front of the truck hood is up because it kind of lifts up from the very front. From that hood is suspended his conical net that he's bought from a pharmacy at some point. And he's sleeping under that net on a cot, you know, outside overnight. And that's his setup. So people will figure it out. You know, I have pictures from Mozambique from last week, people sleeping outside with sticks supporting the net at each of the four corners. That's, you know, great innovation. And Stomp Out Malaria, the Peace Corps initiative, have been working for a long time on trying to propagate is not the right word, but to spread and promote, you know, practices of using nets outside and ways that that can be done. The type of bed that people have is something that we track in durability monitoring because it does make a difference, we think, in the stresses that are put on nets and how long, you know, before they develop holes and then how long people retain them as a result. But people will continue to use them. And I think sometimes we worry that people haven't, you know, tucked them in 100%, or, you know, they're getting up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom or to feed a baby or whatever. And, you know, we can't expect nets to be effective 100% of the night, you know, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for everybody. Like, it's just not, it's not feasible. So we need to have good expectations about, you know, the utility that they can provide under reasonable circumstances. And it, you know, it is going to be a challenge that, you know, we won't get perfect effectiveness out of them, but that's not the fault of the nets. That's just sort of inherent to the way that they're used and,
right,
and their design. I think there's a lot of good work going on in nets that are a little bit better adapted to the ways that mosquitoes target humans. And I know Fredros, you know, has thought a lot about this as well. You know, are there ways to have them kill mosquitoes a little bit more effectively through different active ingredients in the roof where they tend to attack, or different ways of constructing them so that they're bouncing around on the surface of the net more and they pick up more insecticide. So those are all really interesting developments as well.
No, thank you so much, Anna. This was a comprehensive coverage of this topic, and I guess, you know, perhaps just for summary, when designing a social behavior change communication program for whatever intervention it is, we have to look at multiple factors, the differences, and also target them at the individual, at the family level, community level, but also, like Anna said, in the ecosystem. So what is the existing structure already, and how do we design this program so that they do not conflict with what is happening, but rather they enforce whatever the good behavior that we are looking at. So thank you so much for that. I think we proceed now, and we're going to talk a little bit about coverage and access. I know that, again, this is an area that Anna has worked on a lot. We would like, however, to start the questioning with Josh, just to get a different perspective. Just first of all, before we proceed, can you confirm that the first statement in that picture is correct. The first, that people actually use nets when they have them.
You asking me, Fred Rose, to confirm it?
Yeah.
I think, on a
Just
personal,
like a yes or no.
yes, I use a net when I have one net. I always use a net when I have a net, but so I can confirm it on a personal level, and I can say that the data, I think, really speaks for itself on this one, and Hannah knows it probably as well as anybody in the world. But as far as we can tell, people really do use nets in the vast majority when they have it. They don't use them every night, every hour, every day necessarily, and there are certainly people in populations that have struggled with this more, and I think the data on malaria prevalence over time has been the most confirming on this fact, is that it.
So this is interesting. Sorry to interrupt you, but the reason we ask this question first before we go on to the details is, for a long time there was this story that, people have nets but they don't use it, and there are people who believe that the survey is structured. There's a common question: did you sleep under a net last night? That question does not give you the right answer. But the more we look at this data, what?
They don't ask the question like that.
How do they ask it?
That's a common misconception. So that would be a bad way to ask the question. So I agree with people that that would be a leading question. And so that's the reason why in the household surveys, the DHS and the MIS, we don't ask the question that way. What happens in those large household surveys and surveys that are built off of those, which is, RBM, Monitoring Evaluation Reference Group, has standard indicators and ways to ask these questions, and that's what should be used. You make a household roster, so a list of everybody in the house. Each of them is assigned a little number, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then when you get to the section on nets in the questionnaire, there's a net roster. So show me the first net in the household. What brand is it? What color is it? What shape is it? Was it used last night? If it was used, who slept under it last night? And you put in the number from the household roster, whoever it was that slept under that net. This reduces the bias. It doesn't completely eliminate it, but the data have been really so consistent over time that if people were really making up answers, I think the data would look quite different. Right. So we can assume, and of course the question doesn't cover how much of the night were you in it, were you out drinking until 4 a.m. and then you used it from 4 to 6, and then yes, you used it, but that doesn't convey that full protection. But I think that's a common misconception about how the question is asked, and I wanted to take the opportunity to clarify that.
No, but that's an important clarification, actually, because I think that question of bias is important. I just remember that from many conversations, for a long time, it was always like, oh, people have nets, but they don't use it. Mm-hmm. But increasingly you see this data that suggests that, when people have access to a bed net, the use is actually quite high. So it would be nice that we hear from you guys a little bit about this, but also, Anna, if you don't mind, also talk a little bit about your idea, which you've built up over the years, that we should be measuring this on population level rather than household level. So we should not just be looking at the number of households with the access, but actually what proportion of people actually have the access. So those two questions, if you could clarify them, I think they help a lot in understanding access and coverage of IT. And Josh and Marcy, please jump in as well.
Yeah. So I think the misconception that people have nets but don't use them comes directly from the way that we used to measure net indicators. So before 2009, 10-ish, we really relied on the ownership indicator at the household level. So what percentage of households own at least one net? We don't know how many nets they have. We don't know if they have enough. We just know that they have at least one. And those were kind of the first indicators of success of our large scale distributions. They measure the reach of a particular campaign or whatever. Then people would look at the percent of under fives at the beginning of this using a net. And because you have quite frequently multiple under fives in a household, maybe they don't all have the opportunity to use a net. And so even if your ownership is high, which it usually is, because it's relatively easy for households to acquire at least one net, the under 5 use could be, 60, 70%. And so then you would have like 70% versus 90%. And people immediately ask themselves, why is this discrepancy? Why aren't people using their net? We didn't really start asking the question about whether those under 5s or the rest of the population had a net to use in that household until a little bit later. So thank you. Here are our indicators. So the percentage of households that own at least one net is a useful indicator in measuring the success and sort of the spread and reach of the campaign activities or the distribution activities. It doesn't really tell us anything about whether sufficient nets are available for everybody to use it. The next household indicator that we have is what we frequently refer to as the universal coverage indicator, because it's the percentage of households that own one ITN for 2 people, which we've decided is a proxy for everybody being able to use one and having sufficient nets in the household. I think you have to make some assumptions about this, but clearly, this is a reasonable threshold of coverage to want to set. However, it's really difficult, and only very rarely do we reach high levels of this particular indicator. And because nets deteriorate and people have to throw them away because they have deteriorated or they stop using them, we really don't get above around 60% in that indicator at any time. It's quite difficult. And if we do get above it, it's only for maybe a few months right after a campaign. So those are our 2 household level indicators, and denominators are important. I will keep repeating this for the rest of my life. But we can't compare households to people. And so when we want to compare people to people, that's where the ITN access indicator comes in, the last one in this table. This is the proportion of people who in principle could have used a net because there were sufficient net spaces in their house, given the number of people and the number of nets in their house. And so if we can compare the proportion of people who did use a net to the proportion of people within that household that could have used a net, we get a much better indication of the decisions that people are making to use the nets in their household. And this is really helpful, I think, and what we've tried to show over time, and what Amelia Bertozzi-Vila's paper also shows recently in Nature Communications this year. That's where we now have the evidence to say that when people have access to a net, they tend to use it. Overall, I think that proportion is around 90%, 85 to 90% of people are using a net when they have access to one. It does vary.
Would you like me to pull up
Yeah,
Amelie's slide? I think we got a copy of that. Sorry, we have, because of the way Anna is describing things, we're gonna jump a few slides, but just to rhyme with that.
Fred, as you look for for that slide, Hannah, maybe just briefly, what is universal coverage?
Okay.
In terms of the metrics, what's that?
Yeah, what is universal coverage? How much time do you have? Right, so WHO now focuses on population access as the key indicator of universal coverage, because it considers people rather than households. So if we're interested in individual protection and from malaria, ITN access at the population level is the indicator that we do want to focus on. It's a little bit more challenging to calculate, frankly, when you have a data set, but that is the indicator that the WHO is focused on. We will get there eventually, with everybody using that as the primary one. And the other net indicators are also really important to understand in terms of context and everything else. Universal coverage can mean different things to different people. At this point, there's room within the WHO guidance, as I understand it, to set different thresholds for what you want your universal coverage to mean. Clearly, you want to focus on people who are at risk of malaria, and we don't have to cover people who are not at risk of malaria in certain areas or whatever. But is our target 100%? Is it 90%? Is it 80%? With what indicator? What can we reasonably achieve given that it's difficult to, with the current set of funds, achieve even 90% ITN access, which then would get you around 80% maximum ITN use because of that, gap that is just there inherently between use and access.
In your work on, and it would be nice to hear Josh comment on this, but before that, in your work, Anna, where you describe universal coverage of ITNs, you make a specific conclusion that the current strategy that we have, so if I could just read, actually, I think we have a slide for that here, that under the current ITN quantification and distribution strategies, an 80% target, which I believe has been with us for a long time, of households owning at least one net for 2 people is not achievable at a national or sub-national level. So does that mean we have to aim for something like 100% to get the kind of coverage that we want, or just simply changing the measurement to population-based measurement will do the job?
Well, I think the modelers are helpful in determining what level of access provides the most cost-effective impact.
Right.
So, I'm not sure if we know for sure why all of the targets are 80%. That would be an interesting discussion. I think I did try to research that once, and I got back to just 80% sounded like a nice number. Sounds achievable, but you can't put all of the targets for nets at 80% because they don't work that way. And that graph, the first graph, kind of shows they all operate on different strata. If we continue to distribute nets the way that we're doing at the funding that we have and that we've had for the last 10 or 15 years, that's just not enough nets into the system to hit 80% of households owning one ITN for 2 people. And I think that's the point that we were trying to make in this paper. We can frequently hit 80% population access. So if that's actually the better, like if we prefer that as a target to the household ownership, one ITN for 2 people target, then maybe that's sufficient. So I think it's about calibrating the expectations and making sure that programs and planners are aware that if they don't hit a certain target, it's not necessarily because they've done a bad job. It's just that's the way the indicators operate. We'll always have ownership of any ITN highest. Then we're going to have population access. Then we're going to have population use. And then coming in last on the sort of 0 to 100 scale is always going to be households owning one ITN for 2 people. If we want to hit higher targets, we have to put in either more nets or we have to make them more durable or have people keep them longer.
Yeah. So Marcy, when you work with countries and with procurers or the different players, stakeholders involved in this, how do you integrate this information about, coverage and access? How does this play out in the actual implementation, Marcy?
So I'll start really about, what we really try to do with the national programs is access a lot of that data that's just been put into the chat. And so looking at the access and use, because again, like we said, urban and rural, they're not the same. It's not the same picture all the way through an area targeted for a campaign that, some areas might be really, really good use and some areas we might have something less. And so really trying to factor that in when you develop your strategies and what kind of messages or what kind of activities you're going to do to try to get that uptake. I think the other piece on, the net care and repair messaging and how much that's effective, I think that's really over to Hannah again. But, there is, and I've seen it in the chat, there is a lot of discussion about ITN quality. There are concerns being raised, and I think that some of those are valid concerns. But the more durable net, and this comes down to the whole discussion on do we want to have a shorter campaign cycle? And that comes back to the discussion on, human resources and how do you make that happen if you want to just have people doing campaigns all the time, like to put more inputs into the system. So I think I'd turn back a bit to Hannah about, some of the issues that she's seeing around durability and how can we address those? It's part of it is SBC, but maybe there is a more durable net we need to look to in the future if we really want to sustain our coverage. So back to Hannah. Over.
Yeah, I don't know, Fred, if you have a section on durability or anything that you wanted to cover, but
yeah, we will cover durability. So just hold. To be nice to hear from Josh on the question of coverage. Sheila had asked the question of universal coverage, and I just want to bring back the slide from WHO on how the different components, how we maximize population. But Josh, you can discuss it in whichever way you want. You don't have to use this slide.
Sure.
Go ahead, Josh.
Sure. I guess what I would say too is, I'm going to probably drag it back to a big picture at some level too, and just say, at some point we have goals, we have targets, we set them for all these different indicators, different subparts of the program. But the big goal is to stop people from being infected with malaria parasites and stop people from dying or getting sick with malaria because of that, right? And whatever we call universal coverage with nets or universal access or the targets that we specifically set for that, the big goal is really to do this. And those intermediate goals of getting kind of nets coverage up or net access high, however we define them or set them, they're a means, a sort of ways to a means of achieving malaria control. And at the end of the day, it is going to be very hard to achieve 80%, targets in some of these indicators just because of the nature of things. There are always people, no matter how hard you work, no matter how many barriers you remove, that are too hard to reach, that are too recalcitrant, that just hate bed nets, that don't want to sleep under them. Whatever it is, whatever intervention you're talking about, COVID vaccines, bed nets, drugs for malaria, and anything in health is going to be that way. And we see these kinds of things in all sorts of areas when you take a kind of economic lens and you see it as kind of what we call diminishing marginal returns. So you can start throwing, more resources and everything into a situation and you get less and less gain, especially when you get to that last bit. So I think the bigger question is, when is enough on bed nets? We've done an incredible, actually, I think, Marcy, Hannah, all the people delivering nets and campaigns and all the different, Jane Miller's on this call too. People have done such incredible work in expanding access to nets and getting them all over places that are really in need of them. And that's played out in reduced amounts of malaria dramatically over the last 15 years. And I think, we've hit a point where what we're doing works in that sense. We should think about, successes being part in there. We always would like to do more, but I think the truth is bed nets at that level, that's where we're going to be. That's sort of maxing out what we can do. We're going to have to we need more actually tools integrated into that system in the long run. So, and I think we're lucky, this is like within a week ago, we just got this WHO MPAG and SAGE sort of suggesting that we might be able to start using a malaria vaccine at large scales. And that's, really exciting news. There are new tools coming along, but I think too much worry about what that universal coverage loses sight of the fact that it's kind of intermediate in the big term goal and that we are actually succeeding at that, the big term goal because of hitting these somewhere around what we're doing in these intermediate goals.
Yeah, thanks for the reality check here. Sheila and myself have had this discussion about Haiti. Sheila, do you want to talk about how they do this, setting lower goals?
Yeah, Fred, perhaps this is not the forum for that.
Yeah, but it's important that we stay focused on this, on what the main objective is. It's really just nice to hear that we have this reality check. So for the discussion that we were having with Anna, in case you want to hear more, we are highlighting all the key papers. There's a particularly nice description of how this population level, this coverage versus household level coverage plays out. If you want, you can always let us know. We'll give you the slides, but of course they're also on YouTube, and you can access the specific definitions, descriptions. Sheila, back to you.
Fred, I would ask that you take this one.
Okay, so I guess for us, the key question here really, and maybe Josh, you're the best to answer this, given you already started talking about it. Anna and Amelie and a number of other people have published this wonderful paper, which we've used in several masterclasses, really distilling this information about coverage and access. But as you were saying earlier, you can't just scale nets forever, right? You know. In the environment today, people say, put as much resources as possible on your core tools before you start thinking about the supplementary tools. But surely these graphs, they start tapering off at some point, right? So at what level does this curve start flattening, and how important is that?
So that's for me. I mean, I guess I come back to, this is, exactly the shape of that curve. What's going on there is probably something I would have described exactly as kind of diminishing marginal returns. Like at some point, you put in more and more nets per capita, so more nets for every person, but for some reason, you still never quite will get to that last person who's not sleeping under a net or has access to a net. And the curves could be shaped different ways, or it could fall off or flatten out a little earlier. And it's not really a question of, when does it flatten out or when do you stop putting resources into nets? Actually, the question comes into what else do you have to do? And what does it cost? What do those other things cost to do? And how feasible are they to deploy in your area? And when you're either going to stop putting money to nets when you run out of money to put into nets, or you've got something that looks more efficient to you at that point in the curve. Yeah. So that, you can trace this out. If you were thinking of the bottom axis as, total cumulative money you were spending, you would be clearer that it was kind of an economic thing. But then you can see the slope of that curve is basically the marginal cost of getting a little bit more access, right? And that's essentially what you're talking about here. And when that gets to be so much that it costs so much more to buy another 1% of access, that actually you'd be better to spend that on something that for that same amount of money will deliver more health benefit, then that's probably where an economist is going to tell you that's where you switch over, when the marginal cost of bringing more health benefit out of nets is overtaken by spending on, putting IRS into that place, or vaccine, or more drug, access, or something along those lines. And it's really a question that is, going to vary place to place, and it really varies what other things you can do. And for a long time, we've really only been able to do nets from a vector control perspective, either because of budgets or other things. And so, consequently, I think we spent a lot of time thinking about hitting that ceiling and how can we get closer and closer to this 100%. And, and there's nothing wrong with that. When that's the tool that you have, that's what you should be doing. And we've been very successful at it. I'm just keep coming back to that, but it's kind of amazing to look back at what's happened and really see how well that's worked. But I think we're increasingly in a space where these questions get really complicated. And I know you had earlier in there that they are going to become more and more local decisions and other things. There's going to be more variability in that. And in this masterclass, we have a lot more specific questions on this diminishing returns, and also economy of scale and all that. But before we proceed, it would be nice to hear from Marcy. Marcy, what are your thoughts on how much, how many, someone mentioned earlier that there are just not enough nets out there to address the gaps. Especially if we rely on this 80% so-called coverage. So, Marcy, what are your thoughts on just the quantities of nets that we have to push, if we have to have shorter cycles, as you were saying earlier, or longer cycles? How do we determine when to stop doing nets and start putting this
on something else.
So, I mean, I'm going to start at the big picture with this 1.8, and I'm going to start with that on the initial quantification that we're doing and the challenges we're seeing there, because this has been an issue that's been raised by national programs and partners for years. And I mean, Hannah kind of touched on it at the start. I mean, there's never enough nets, but then there's always nets left over, right? So there's kind of that whole sort of contradiction, and like, how do you have nets left over if you didn't have enough? Because, you know, that kind of doesn't work. So we've been doing a lot of work around the 1.8. There's a lot of concern that 1.8 doesn't really reflect, you know, the reality. Census was done. I mean, I worked in the Central African Republic for 4 years. Your census was done in 2003. We're projecting that forward to what, 2020, with all the population displacement. So, you know, in a lot of countries, this factor is not working. And so we've been trying to look at other options. And I know that a lot of the partners to national programs have been using previous campaign data to try to better adjust that base quantification figure that you're going to use to something that's more aligned to what you registered in your last campaign, to not start with those shortages. That said, Fredros, I think we can keep doing this forever. And I think there will never be enough nets, right? And it will just keep adjusting that factor. And finally, we're going to end up with one net to one person. You know, and at that point, we've kind of something's gone wrong, right? Because there's supposed to be all those other channels that are working. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I think moving forward, we need to really get to more decentralized data collection to let us know, when do you need to trigger? And maybe you don't need to trigger a big campaign in every district every 3 years. Maybe, you know, maybe some are 2 and some are 4. Maybe they're even longer. Maybe other channels could get your coverage back up without doing a campaign. I think not looking at the subnational situation and just making an assumption that we need to blanket everybody every 3 years, I think that's also an inefficient use of resources, because I don't think it's actually based on a reality. And I will actually hand to Hannah, because she's been using Amelia's paper on some of the quantification to look at that 1.8 factor as well.
Fredros, can I jump in real quick too, just to say, we used this language a couple of times just to say, stop doing nets and start doing something else. I want to be clear that I'm not at all talking about stopping doing, I'm talking about adding other things on top.
When do we stop nets, you know? Not just stop, but withdraw nets. You know, there's also this.
And that's a thing that I'm not
that's a whole other
conversation.
conversation.
Very different thing that I'm talking about.
All right. So this is, as you can see, definitely a very interesting topic. And we're going to continue with this. Before that, let's talk a little more about cost. And Josh, yes, we're going to talk about cost effectiveness quite a bit today. But before that, we asked Marcel this question last, and it would be nice to revisit this question again. Someone needs to, we need to make better case for malaria eradication or malaria elimination. And for this, we need numbers. And at the moment, people are referring to Jeff Sachs' paper from, 2004, whatever. So we'll talk about that. But in the simplest form possible, given the GDP per capita for most of these malarious countries, as you can see there, what, in your opinion, is the best way to make a case for continued engagement on malaria control?
The best way to make a case for it. I mean, I guess, this comes back to, now you're asking me about something that I'm really not an expert in, which is advocacy. But I think the case comes back to there's a couple, and one is that I hope, maybe I'm naive in hoping, but that most of our societies are organized around working collectively to make people's lives better in those societies and make them healthier, make them live longer, whatever, that those are, the big overarching goals of what we're trying to do in different ways. And so this is one of the world's sort of low-hanging fruits in that dimension. We actually have tools that work on this disease. We know some of the things that we can do to do it. We can treat the disease and other things, and simply, and it doesn't actually cost that much. We talk about this and we use big numbers for money, and there's probably, I don't remember exactly the number, but the most recent estimates of what goes into malaria control around the world is around $3 billion a year, 2 to 3 billion. We need an awful lot more than that to do what we should be doing. But, and that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. but it's not a lot of money for the world. So I think, you know, we've got low cost tools, low hanging fruit in a lot of senses for this. So there's just a sort of kind of an emotional or moral case for doing it in a lot of ways, but also I think you can make a hard numbers case, like I see the things you're highlighting here. If you go back to the Jeff Sachs estimates, if you look at all the work that was done, you know, scientifically by Dave Smith and others, kind of with Chai, looking at, you know, what happens when you eliminate malaria? Does it stick around? Is that problem solved permanently? Or are you likely to, you know, return back to a malaria state? And the relationship between what's happened in countries that have successfully eliminated over time with returns to malaria, which is in truth, not very often does that happen. And there's a lot of good, you know, hard money cases that you could at least make a healthy, you know, argument that this will be economically beneficial for countries that suffer from malaria, but also for countries that are wealthy countries that don't have malaria or never did or don't anymore. You know, like the US where I live now and where I, you know, was born and raised. That we reap a lot of benefits as well from successfully doing that, whether it's growth of countries that will be trading partners or other things. And I think you can build those cases successfully that way too.
So these images are from the original working paper by Jeffrey Sachs and colleagues. And the way they did it was, you know, you have these malaria indices on the left, and then you have the need, the economics on the side. And they came up with a number, which I think was 1.3% GDP loss overall. Now, in recent times, some people have revisited this, and we have this publication from 2019, I believe, that looks at the numbers again and describes why it's important. What you see clearly here is that the lowest income countries have the greatest, you know, would have the greatest gain if we eliminated malaria. It's of course a much more simplified way to look at it, but it's important that we are looking at that. So I just wanted to highlight those in addition to what Josh said, as a preamble to the discussion on cost effectiveness. So of course, realizing that we don't have enough money, we don't have all the money that we need, but there is clearly a good case economically to invest in malaria elimination. As you can see here, in some countries like Uganda, you would have, you know, massive, almost 15%, you know, gain in GDP if we could go to zero malaria. So there's really good value for money there. Now, Josh,
I see Jessica Rockwood is pointing something out in the chat that there have been, you know, these kind of investment cases that have been developed as well. And this new work from Nayantara Sarma and Edith Patiard and others is really great. But just to also point out that, you know, these numbers that you talk about, they sound small, 0.3% in this new paper. I think you're right, maybe 1.3% in the original sort of Gallup and Sachs paper. If you go back, you know, 20 years or whatever when that paper came out. But to remind everybody that we're talking about compound interest, and it's one of the most powerful forces in the, you know, universe. If you talk about it, those things build on each other every year, grow exponentially. So it really, even small, you know, impacts on GDP growth or income growth can lead over, you know, 10 periods, huge gains for places. So,
and they're actually not small. I mean, if you think about this paper says a 10% decrease in malaria burden would give you, you know, 0.3% GDP growth. So that is not a small. That's not small growth.
No, that's what I'm saying. It sounds like a small number, but it's not a small number actually.
It's not a small number. And then you have this heterogeneity. So for low income countries that have a lot of malaria, you see there you could get gains of, you know, up to 15%. So I think personally that there is a fairly good economic case for doing this. The question is whether the investment will be available. In the global technical strategy, the numbers used there are upwards of 40 to 1, you know, a return on investment. So I think that. But I wanted us to use that as a preamble to the discussion on cost effectiveness. And again, back to you, Josh, and our other experts can join in this as well. Josh, it's always argued, and I think people like Professor Christian Langela have made this case, that malaria control, and especially vector control, is one of the most cost-effective interventions. How accurate is this? And here is a summary, a review from Imperial College comparing different malaria control options here. So 2 questions here. How accurate is that information? And number 2, what is the best number for us to be looking at? Is it cost per DALI? Is it cost per death averted? Or is it cost per case reduced? What would you advise us to be looking at given the differences? Back to you.
So yeah, so I think the first piece, I think that is true. I think it's in that zone. I mean, like I said before, malaria is low-hanging fruit. We have inexpensive things they can do. It's got a very high burden. And I think, it may not be, I think my last time I looked across the whole board at what these numbers were, the single most cost-effective health intervention that we had was iodization of salt. But it's in this spectrum. Malaria vector control has always been kind of in this spectrum that looks like childhood vaccinations, or right in that bottom end of, cost per whatever health outcome you sort of define it in such a way that it's almost a no-brainer that we should be investing in this. If we want to improve health globally around the world, this is one of the most efficient ways we can do it, is preventing malaria. And we should be able to get enough money to do that, I think. So that's, that picture, I 100% support that. I think it's still accurate. I don't think anybody's come up with anything much more efficient, than malaria, especially malaria vector control, but other parts of malaria control as well. In terms of, the sort of these ways of measuring cost effectiveness, there's 2 parts to cost effectiveness, and cost effectiveness is just really a tool for making decisions about which intervention to do in which places. And the 2 parts of it are the cost, so sort of the top of the ratio, and then the outcome that you choose, the bottom of the ratio. And you could choose cases, you could choose deaths, you could choose DALIs, you could choose whatever. I mean, and actually any number of things. And really what you use for that kind of depends on the question. And we spend a lot of time, when I teach students on this kind of topic, or when you're trying to design a study around those kinds of questions, you spend a lot of time debating what's the right outcome to use, but it really depends on the question. So if you're comparing, and that question depends on the choice you're trying to make. And that's a really thing you have to structure. So if we're trying to say, what's the best drug to use as a first-line treatment in Tanzania for uncomplicated malaria in children, or something like that, it might be fine to say, what's the cost per, case averted, or whatever you want to say, or death averted in that particular case. If you're trying to make a comparison and make a choice between something that's a malaria intervention and something that's not a malaria intervention, then clearly you can't use cases of malaria averted there at that point. And, eventually you realize that, and this becomes especially true when you start thinking about, the financing picture for malaria, which isn't just the Global Fund or, PMI or donors, even though they're big chunks of it. It's also governments of endemic countries that provide a lot of the financing for malaria prevention and control through supporting health systems and others. They're making choices between education spending, and vast other domains. And then it becomes really hard to choose your outcome. So, I guess I would say, more than worrying about choosing cost per death, cost per DALI, what outcome you're looking at, really first focus on how are you framing your question? What are you making a comparison between, and what is the choice you're trying to guide with that information? Because without that choice framework, and without really shaping your decision and framing it, it doesn't matter. It's the information isn't very useful without a decision that you're really focused on.
Fred, you're muted.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Sheila. Yeah.
Yeah, Josh, so IRS seems quite cost effective. So how come it is not widespread? Is there a reason, or how do we choose interventions? If not,
well, I mean, I think, yeah, so you're getting at something that's there, or sort of trying to hint at maybe in that, which is that cost effectiveness is one tiny tool that's kind of part of the economics toolbox. It's economic evaluation, but it is far from the only part of making a decision, right? You have cost effectiveness is a good thing, but it just tells you an efficient way of doing something. It doesn't necessarily tell you whether that way is affordable, for one. It doesn't tell you whether it's feasible in a particular setting that you're imagining implementing that thing when you look at the sort of predicted cost effectiveness or cost effectiveness from other settings. So you really have to think of those other things. And I think one of the big barriers to IRS being more widespread is on one side is affordability, because it's very it can be quite cost effective, but it also is not a tremendously cheap intervention. So it costs more to deliver IRS to a household than it does to deliver enough bed nets to that household. In almost every setting that I've thought about what that affordability kind of number is and the budget impact. And so
Josh, can you go slow a little bit in this? How can
Sure.
something be cost effective when
and
it's
not
expensive?
affordable.
Sure.
We are not economists.
So basically the idea is one other dimension that you have to consider aside from what would be the most efficient way of delivering gains is, can you just afford it at all? So if you choose a just as efficient intervention or even a more inefficient intervention that actually costs more to deliver on scale, you may find that what you do is achieve the same health gains by giving it to a smaller number of people. And that is not always an equitable way to do things. Often we don't want to do that. Cost effectiveness by itself doesn't really consider equity. It doesn't consider the total affordability of an intervention, and it doesn't consider, I saw somebody had the chat, doesn't even consider whether it's feasible or acceptable in a given area. So you have to pair that kind of number and that kind of calculation with a bunch of other dimensions of research. And if you go to like places that do this really well, or at least considered in policy generally, in in the UK, please don't anybody consider me an expert on the UK's regulatory systems, but they have an entire institute, that's essentially dedicated to what they call health technology assessment. And that's, similar to the way an FDA or something works in the US, but that considers all these kind of dimensions. Is it an efficient way to deliver healthcare? Is it acceptable? Is it feasible? Is it equitable? And there's another comment about sustainability. We could spend a lot of time discussing sustainability and what that means, but there's many other dimensions besides just cost effectiveness. Cost effectiveness is a great tool for picking out the thing that's going to give you the most health benefit for the least cost. But if you don't think in the other dimensions, you can make some choices with only that tool that are bad.
Yeah, Josh, that's interesting to learn that cost effectiveness doesn't always mean affordability. So thinking about that and comparing between, so knowing that the standard nets that we have now, they are used widely, they're used by more people, or there's high coverage compared to the new nets that we have now. And thinking here is that the standard nets are used more widely, and therefore they have become cheaper. So is it your opinion that once the coverage and distribution of PBO nets or the new nets picks up, that the cost will reduce?
I think there's a number of dimensions that are going on here. I do think for new classes of nets that are coming on, the new nets, whether they be PBO, whether they be these dual AI nets or other things, that the prices of those commodities will go down over time for a number of reasons. One is that the market will likely get bigger for them. I mean, we can all touching wood here because I'm certainly hoping that's the case. I think we do want to see that happen. And that will lead to various things, probably competition between providers. It will lead the providers themselves to maybe experience some economies of scale in production. And so those things hopefully will bring the prices of the commodities themselves down. And that will hopefully occur. The other thing this chart is interestingly showing, which is looking at whether there are economies of scale in the distribution programs based on how big those programs get. And this has been an area where I just don't think we see very much of it. You can kind of see there's a little bit of a hint that maybe that's the case. But for those of you who, spend time with data and regressions and look at those lines, you see that probably a lot of that downward slope in those dotted lines is being driven by one point way out there at the very end of that. That's a very large programs or something. So it's sort of debatable whether we'll get much economies of scale in the cost of distribution per se. But what has happened, I think, maybe more so, and Marcy can probably speak to this, is that, and Hannah too, because all of the AMP work and all of the effort that's gone into the global learning about how to do distributions at scale has certainly led to people being better at it. And I'm sure more efficient at it. But it's actually kind of a hard thing to measure. You'd think it would be very straightforward and easy to do, but it's a lot more painful than you'd suggest. So I think there's some learning by doing that's brought costs down as well for manufacturers of nets, but also for programs delivering, whether it's mass distribution or continuous distribution, that's not necessarily related to the scale at which they work.
Yeah, Josh, that's actually interesting.
Sheila, can I jump in for a second and then
please go ahead.
I think what's interesting about what Josh just said, and I think, when you looked at the market pre-COVID, I think he's right, that we would expect the net costs to go down, right? The average net costs. But what we're actually seeing right now is a problem. We're seeing a problem because oil prices have gone up by almost 30%. And oil is I had no idea about this, by the way, until I started doing that whole WHO, malaria, COVID-19 stuff. But oil is a major chunk of the costs for yarn, which are a major part of the manufacturing of nets. So actually between that, some of those costs going up, and then the global shipping situation just being such a mess right now. And, containers having gone up by up to 4 to 10 times in terms of costs. And I think, and I'm going to come back to Hannah a bit on the price down in quality, but then really to Josh as well, when we think forward about a potentially higher net cost, a higher shipping cost, a fixed envelope, and the potential knock-on effects on market health for purchase of a product that addresses your insecticide resistance profile, but now no longer fits into your budget because of all of these external factors that are changing. And so just to raise that point, and then I think, there's also a question about, pricing and quality, and is there a relation between these things? And I think they're probably two very important points for people on this call. Over.
I mean, one, just to come back with what Marcy's saying, I think, that's certainly right. I hope that nets are made of polyester, they're made of polyethylene, which at the end of the day is, old dinosaurs that are taken out of the ground and converted into plastics, and oil price drives these things in a lot of ways. And the current shipping situation is it might actually turn out that this could be bigger, disruption to net distribution than COVID was, which is kind of sort of sad and shocking in a way. But I hope that both of those things are short-lived in the sense of, in the big picture of the next 10 years of malaria control, that's not going on. But I think beyond that, she makes a really good point, which is that, what we see, and I've mentioned it before and we're all mentioning it here, is like, we're not looking at a situation, if we go from the malaria control, malaria elimination, burden reduction picture, we're really not talking about just nets forever, that we have other tools that need to be in, and even the nets we need new kinds of nets, we need new classes of drugs. Anytime you bring a new product to market like that, it's going to cost more. And it brings me back to the big picture, which is, I think it might have been Jerry Colleen that once said to me, it's fine to have all you health economists running around telling us when we should switch first line drugs, when the resistance level gets to X and the price is Y and blah, blah, blah. But what you really need is a bigger pie. And I think that is one thing that we need to think about. If you go back and look at the financing numbers for malaria in the World Malaria Reports over the last 4 or 5 years, you'll see around 2014, 2015 or so, we started to hit these really big numbers, $2 billion, $3 billion a year, and we haven't gone up from there since then. And it's not enough money, and it won't be enough money to deliver RTSS at scale.
Yeah.
On top of what we're already doing. People are doing heroic work to deliver bed nets at massive scales in very efficient ways. As Marcy said earlier, some of the people on the ground who are really doing it are now doing it for less than they were doing that work 4 or 5 or 10 years ago in extreme ways. And we just need a bigger pie, really. I mean, that's
Josh, pie is a very American thing, Western thing. So,
okay, yes.
What analogy would you use for sub-Saharan Africa? A bigger ugali, maybe?
We need enough ugali for everybody to get a fair share. We need enough cake for everybody to be able to have dessert. I mean, however you want to say it, food is a pretty easy one. But really, I think we will be faced with the situation that, yes, the prices of these products, I think, will probably come down in the 5-year time zone, but we'll be talking about something else and we'll need money for that too. So we need to work hard, I think, collectively as a community in figuring out how we can leverage whatever, advocacy power we have in our own individual places to expand that pie one way or another, the cake or the, ugali, whatever we want to talk about.
Cool. So we still have more to say about this subject, but because it's being mentioned a lot, we have in this publication from Imperial, they actually also did something really interesting here, which was to look at what constitutes. So sorry guys, the slide size is not great, but what really constitutes the actual cost of these products. And there's ITNs at the top. You have IRS, intermittent preventive treatments, and then diagnosis and case management there, and many others. And you see here, for example, that storage is a big deal for IRS. The blue line there. The bed net, the insecticide, the green line there is playing quite a big role. The nets itself. So, I guess as you were saying earlier that all these things will need some context-specific decisions overall, and I just wanted to put that over there. But I know Shayla has a question about resistance as well. So, Shayla, go ahead.
Yeah, Fred. So I think before I ask that question on resistance, I also had a question, Josh. So you did some work on costing of the distribution of bed nets. And I just had a quick question about that specific study and what the outcomes were in terms or are in terms of what the major cost drivers are when you're thinking about the different channels of distribution.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've done a few different studies that involve costing of bed nets and bed net distribution things over time. I mean, I sort of started my career really doing that as, my PhD was about looking at large scale kind of vector control and what was the most efficient way and what was the right path forward in sub-Saharan Africa doing that. And that study or set of studies was really about looking at different ITN. Some people on here definitely remember all the debates around, really heated debates around how we were going to get ITNs into populations back in the early 2000s. And also, it was also looking at whether we should be, whether IRS might be more cost effective in some settings than those things. So it was a sort of study around that where we looked at a lot of distribution systems. And one of the big things that came away from that work was that this new thing that people were trying to do big mass campaigns where they gave away free ITNs was actually pretty remarkably cost efficient. And also it, you know, had this other feature, which is that it was one of the fastest ways we'd seen to increase, you know, coverage of nets and access to nets and other things. And, you know, at the time that I started that work, I think they'd done one nationwide mass campaign. It was in Togo, integrated with the measles vaccination campaign, if I'm remembering back that far into my youth well. And
you got it right. It's right. It was my first campaign. I was the delegate on ground for that one. So you've got the
so
right.
And we found, you know, and there were a bunch of things that we were comparing it to, some of which we do. And I think we sort of stumbled into the biggest kind of behavior change intervention basically around nets that we still use everywhere to this day. And that was to make nets, the cost of nets to the people that use them, nearly nothing, and bring them close to their homes, make them very easy to get, and make, you know, very inexpensive to get. And that really, it turns out that sort of worked. And it's what we've scaled with bed nets, and it's led to a lot of success. And I'm not sort of taking credit for that. The people who came up with the idea and really put it to the ground did it. But that was, you know, that work. And we saw there were a lot of other systems, and we still work with some of these other systems now to distribute nets, but there were, you know, either they were sometimes less cost effective, or we were slower to raise coverage directly in the first place with them, or there were some other equity issues related to the prices of nets and things that, you know, that led to us adopting this as the kind of main strategy for it. So, you know, that was kind of, it was really exciting to get to work on that work at the time. I was really intimidated by, you know, the basic asks that I had to do and the question I was trying to answer, but also really lucky, you know, you had at the end to talk about your career a little bit and stuff. And that was really, it was incredibly lucky timing. And the work that I got to do was, it was really amazing because I met a lot of people who were sort of giants in malaria control and implementation and research around Africa and the process of doing that. It's just one of the kind of, it's an experience I feel really, really privileged and lucky to have had and just kind of stumbled into, really.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. Fred, do you have any follow-ups? You're muted.
No, as Josh was saying, we have at least one or two questions around that towards the end. So I think because of time, we just move forward.
Yeah.
If you want, did you want to ask this resistance question, or shall we proceed?
Yeah, let's ask this one. Just a quick one, Josh, and on what the impact of drug resistance as well as insecticide resistance would be on the cost effectiveness of the tools that we have.
I mean, so to say in general what they'll do, or what we think they'll do, or what we know they do in all these cases, is to make them less cost effective, right? We assume that resistance to drugs or insecticides or whatever other, you know, thing you're talking about is generally going to reduce the effectiveness of the intervention, but it's not going to change how much it costs to deliver. So it's going to reduce the efficiency overall, make them less cost-effective tools to use. But I think that's all well and good. That's sort of like measuring a number that's kind of arbitrary. But the real answer is that what it also means is it's going to make switching to other things more attractive for programs. And it leads us into this kind of decision space about when do we change from doing things the old way to the new way? And more importantly, how do we make sure there's a new way out there to switch to when the tools that we have start to fail? And that's, you know, that takes us back to the financing thing, which is we need to make sure that the you know, the plate of ugali is big enough that R&D folks also are developing new tools for us along the way.
Thank you so much. And you're right, brings us back to the money thing. Yes,
Fred, I think there was a question in the chat on costs. I think let's just finish or try to.
Okay.
So there was a question from one of our participants on whether they've done our speakers today have done any analysis on the distribution on the analysis on the relationship between the distribution cost per net and coverage, if there is any information on that or any thoughts around that.
This is a question about the distribution cost per net and coverage. That's a trickier one.
We have, I don't know if this helps. There's a figure that we showed earlier from the same Imperial Group publication here on what contributes to those pies, well, the transport and so on. I don't know if that can be useful.
I mean, I think, yeah, actually it is, Fredros, and it took me a second to think of why this might be the case. But when you think about the distribution of costs per net, right? What goes into that unit cost of distributing a single net? And you look at that chart in Imperial, you can't read those labels, but I can tell you that the green bar at the bottom is the price of an ITN. That's the net, the commodity cost itself. And you can see in almost every one of those bars, almost all of that price is coming from the net, a big chunk of it. No matter what program I've ever looked at, it's never been less than 30, 40%. And it's often been much higher, 60, 70%. And if you really look at the financial costs alone that the sort of campaigns incur without missing other things, it's often a much higher percentage than that even. And what that means is that there's not a lot of scope for economies of scale and distribution, because the cost of distributing one net is always going to include the price of one net. So if that's most of what's driving it, the biggest cost driver, you're not going to be able to bring it down no matter how you do. But that being said, there's another slide you showed earlier that we talked about the diminishing marginal returns. And if you think instead about the price of one net, and you think about the cost of the whole program, it is going to get worse and worse probably as you get to those last people. If you really want to get the last person in Malawi sleeping under a bed net, each and every night of the year, the cost to get that last person is probably going to be astronomical. And at some point, you as a program manager or whatever, intuitively know that anyway, and you're never going to find that person and tie them down and put them under a bed net no matter what is going to happen. So you don't really worry about finding them because it's not worth the money at that point. And thankfully, bed nets have effects that aren't just for the person who sleeps under them. So the real question is what we really need to do from a malaria control perspective in that one is realize when we're protecting people from malaria and when we've got enough people sleeping around them that they're also protected. And that happens probably earlier when the insecticide is effective. That probably happens a lot earlier than we realize.
And I think this is also, thanks a lot, Sheila. I think this is also obvious in the Anna Amelie publication, where you see much of the gains is happening earlier on in the nets. And we've discussed briefly about that, but what you also see is this is the incremental cost effectiveness graph from the 2003, I believe, the WHO Choice Program. So Josh, this is something you've worked on for many, many years. And you have your starting intervention in malaria. We have the so-called core interventions. And at the end of that dot, whatever you choose to add, you have to check whether the cost of adding it is too high compared to the amount of benefit you're getting. And you are better off with that graph staying as flat as possible. Is that the right way to say it, Josh?
I mean, I guess you see, this is an ICER chart. It's kind of, you can see you've got a sort of total health benefit on the bottom side and total cost on the top side. And one important thing to look at is to remember is that all those black dots are meant to be mutually exclusive choices that you're making. So you can't do C1 and C2 really per se for a given person anyway that you're talking about, or a given population. And so what you're doing, you're right, is like basically the further out to the right you go, the more lives you're saving or the more cases of malaria you're averting, and the further up to the top you go, the more expensive what you're trying to do is. So you can imagine most things, to get out to the right, you have to spend more and more money. And what we usually do, and you'll never be able to see me point at this chart, but I'm trying to trace with my finger the furthest rightmost line there, which is what we call the frontier, or the cost effectiveness plane. And, you know, so C1 on that chart is going to be the most cost effective thing on the chart, because it delivers the most health benefit per dollar spent, or whatever your cost unit is. But it's not the best intervention that you could do. And this goes back to what I was saying, where that's cost effectiveness by itself is one dimension. The best intervention you can do is actually C4, way up at the top there, because it delivers more health benefit than C1 if you gave it to everybody. The problem is you only have so much budget. And so the way you use a chart like this is you look out, you draw that frontier between the furthest right and upwardmost points, and then you start looking up the y-axis at the cost, and you say, okay, but I only have $80. What should I do? Well, if you only have 80, maybe you do C2 instead of C1, even though it's less cost effective, but it will deliver more health benefit. And if that's, you know, your choice space is these set of interventions here, that's what you would do. Right. And in some cases, you could actually think about, depending on the interventions, mixing C3 for some small set of people and then C2 for other ones, if your threshold for budget falls between, you know, what it would cost to give C2 to everybody and what it would cost to give C3 to everybody. And that's where this also, the cost effectiveness alone sort of fails, because then you're faced with an equity question. Like, is it better to, can you give some people one intervention and other people another? And how do you decide who those people that get the better intervention are?
No, we get that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, now with the arrival of the vaccine, if we don't grow the ugali, you know, you have that much pie, and you know, a proportion of it is already earmarked for, you know, this is a graph from Global Fund. It's probably not true anymore. This is from 2018.
So Fred, that's PAP in Southern Africa. It's called ugali is PAP.
PAP. Okay, PAP. So there's a size of PAP. You have to grow the size of the PAP and do that. But let's proceed now. We have only about 20 minutes left in the masterclass, and then we will proceed to other things that people want to do. It would be nice to go back to Anna a little bit and discuss a subject that is also increasingly important. Thanks a lot, Josh, for the descriptions. Anna, to what extent does age and gender play when it comes to the ITN use?
Yeah, so age and gender are quite important in determining who is sleeping under a net, particularly in households that don't have enough. They have to prioritize. They have to make choices within the house about who's under the net and who can't be under the net, because there's not enough space for everybody. So this paper was a really nice one, because we worked with the entire Vectorworks team on it, and everybody had an opportunity to kind of look at pick a country and look at the data, and we all put it together. And it's also, these graphs are also on the itnuse.org website, which summarizes ITN use indicators for each country for the most recent survey and previous surveys. So if you want to take a look at these graphs, they're all kind of showing the same thing, because these trends are somewhat systematic. So the dotted lines represent males and females living in households where there aren't enough ITNs. There's at least one, but there's not enough for everybody. And you can see, maybe, except that the print is so small,
sorry,
under
guys,
fives, no, it's okay. So the peaks of net use are among the kids age 0 to 5. And then the women, the purple dashed lines of reproductive age, essentially. So 20 to 30 or 40 in each of the graphs. So what that tells us, the spikes in those dotted lines, is that those little babies and the women of reproductive age are the ones who are prioritized for net use in the households where there's not enough. As a corollary, The people who are not prioritized are the kids, ages 5 to about 15. And those are our school age children who maybe are, starting at age 10-ish, approaching puberty. There's different sleeping arrangements that happen once kids reach puberty in many households. And maybe what we're providing in terms of nets is not sufficient to accommodate all of those sleeping arrangements, or the family just doesn't have enough nets in good condition to be able to manage that. The interesting thing for me in these graphs is that in the solid lines, which is people living in households that do have enough nets, those discrepancies start evening out. They're a little bit there, right? We see men are a little bit lower in the gray line than the women in the purple lines. But the age discrepancies and the gender discrepancies really even out quite a bit. So when we have enough nets, we can, quote unquote, solve a lot of the age and gender discrepancies that we're observing at insufficient coverage. And I think that's a really important lesson for programs that are trying to address equitable, net distribution. Putting enough nets in there in the first place is really a big key to mitigating that issue.
So two key lessons here. One is that so age and gender are a major factor. It appears that the peak net use is in the younger age, the younger children, and then middle ages, 30 to 40. The other message here is that if we can ensure that access is maximized, that they actually use, that you will not see these dips that you see in the school age kids, right?
Yep, that's
Okay.
what we're seeing. The other thing I'll say here is that these households where there are enough and where they're not enough are not necessarily exactly the same. So in these graphs in particular, I think the households that own enough nets tend to be smaller on average than the houses with, not enough nets, just because they tend to have more people and then it's harder for them to get enough nets.
Yeah, but this data is from many, many countries and it seems
Yes.
consistent.
It's very consistent. I have looked at each and every survey.
Yeah. So,
Over 100 surveys.
So with that in mind, from an epidemiology perspective, we have this new data that is, we've known this for many years, but it's increasingly being important. Here is an example of work from Uganda. And now look at that age group. So in your graphs, you see this dip here. In this graph, if you look at which age group is contributing or is impacted most by malaria, it's exactly the same age group.
Yep.
Is there a sense in which the school-going kid is being neglected? And what do we do about it? And this is a question to you and to Marcy and Josh as well.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting and important opportunity that a lot of people are starting to consider. Obviously, there's a number of researchers that have been looking at school-age children at London School, Sean Clark, the groups at University of Maryland and University of Arizona. There's an important opportunity to address this transmission reservoir in school-age children by specifically targeting them with interventions. Now, whether that's drug-based interventions, preventative interventions, or nets, I think all of those are important considerations. Tanzania has a large-scale school-based net distribution system that specifically targets primary school attending children every year. The intention of that program is that the nets that go into those households through the school-age children get shared within the household and also outside the household, although probably not as much outside the household sharing as we would prefer, but that's their prerogative. Addressing school-age kids as you don't want to just refer to them as transmission reservoirs, but they are contributing a lot, and it has a huge impact on school attendance as well. Which has knock-on effects. So yeah, I think, and Josh can comment on this and Marcy as well, and probably some of the people on the call. There's a lot to be said and modeled to kind of show the impact of improving coverage of ITNs for those kids.
Yeah. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just seconding what you were saying. I think that there probably is. I'm not totally an expert on school age children, but I think that it's also a place in the life cycle for most kids where there's rather much more limited regular contacts with the health system, and there are a lot of challenges, but we do see some exciting things. Like, I think, Hannah's very aware of all that work, obviously, of the SchoolNet program in Tanzania, targeting these kinds of age groups, but also the expansion that people are working with of SMC and the Sahel to start reaching out to children who are 10 years old in some settings and experimenting with that to see if it works. I mean, there are things that are coming along, but I think you're right, and this is an area that we need extra focus on.
Yeah, and I guess just from my side, I think, this comes down to the way we're currently quantifying for campaigns and then implementing campaigns. We're either allocating by people, right? 1 net to 2 people and capping somewhere because we don't have enough nets, or we're allocating by sleeping space. And I don't think either one of those are accurate enough, so to speak, to cover those children who are missing right now. So meaning when you do 1 to 2, you don't factor in anything about sleeping spaces. Then when you do sleeping spaces, you might get a pretty subjective definition or allocation in terms of how a sleeping space is defined, whether someone considers it's actually a sleeping space. I say it's a sleeping space, somebody sleeps there. You don't count it because you don't believe me that it's a sleeping space. So, it's all of that, right? Because a sleeping space can come out at 10 o'clock at night and you don't see it in the daytime. So you can't verify it if it's in the middle of your kitchen. So, when you start to look at that, we're so imprecise on how we're allocating to different configurations of families that campaigns alone in our current way we're doing them aren't going to solve this problem. And so whether it's we need a new campaign strategy and allocation approach, or whether it's we need better continuous distribution channels to fill gaps and sustain access after mass distributions, I think is a key question that needs to be answered. Over.
No, thank you. Thank you guys so much. We did have a question. So I think that's very well addressed and clearly a gap there. We did have a question on seasonal variation here. We will skip this for the sake of time, but we can catch that, check that with Anna at a later time. I'm going to hand this back over to my colleague Shayla, because we have a number of questions on durability here as well. So just 3 things left. So questions on durability, some questions on net distribution methods, including the SchoolNet program, which we'd like to talk about a little bit more. And then finally, we have some questions on the private sector involvement. So Shayla, please.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. I think, Hannah, in the beginning, at some point, you had started talking about durability, the durability of nets that are distributed. So given this study and what the findings are, how does durability of these nets or of nets generally influence or impact on access?
Yeah, hugely. If a net is wearing out, if it develops holes and people throw it away as a result, or tear it into strips to tie their fencing together, that net's no longer protecting people. So durability is the reason why net access levels can't be maintained. Particularly in a campaign cycle situation where you're putting in a lot of nets into one cohort at one time, then they're all wearing out at slightly different rates, but as a cohort, they're wearing out, and you're losing coverage as those nets are deteriorate over time. We can't expect nets to last forever. There are ways for nets to last longer. Some of those are in their physical characteristics, and there's some work ongoing currently to try and incorporate a little bit better metrics of lab-based methods, hopefully, to ensure that nets are as durable as they can be without then significantly increasing in price. But I think more importantly, what we see from basically all of the durability monitoring data that has been collected over the last 10 plus years is that behaviors and taking care of nets and the environment that nets are being used in really varies from place to place, from village to village. And you can have neighboring districts where nets are lasting a year because the nets, there's lots of rodents in that area, and the nets aren't being protected from the rodents, and the rodents are just taking chunks out of those nets for their own nests to protect their own babies from vector-borne diseases. And in the neighboring district, the nets are lasting perfectly well on a kind of 3-year cycle, because the environment is slightly different, and maybe the habits and the washing practices or whatever are a little bit improved. We can do certain things to help improve net durability from a consumer standpoint, from the household standpoint, encouraging households to tie their nets up during the day to keep them away from children and chickens and goats or whatever else is coming into the household to kind of yank at them. Protecting them from rodents obviously would be really nice. It's not always possible. But the variation in the behavioral context seems to be greater, generally speaking, than the variation between the products themselves. And I think it is important to continue monitoring the products to understand whether or not there are problems with quality in lots or across products. But we need to keep in mind that settings are going to be so different. We really have to triangulate very carefully across products in different settings to determine what's going on.
So Anna, actually, we have looked at some of the work that you guys have done in multiple countries with yourself, Albert Killian, and so. Forgive me, colleagues on the line. We unfortunately haven't ascribed the authorship of this specific paper that's currently displayed properly. It's unfortunately covered under the slide. This is a publication by Dr. Lena Lawrence and my colleague Sarah Moore and other people on this call. Just in case you want to search for this call, apologies for not ascribing that. But Anna, while you were saying, when we looked at your own work with your group on this, and this net durability question, people often say durability, but there's multiple features here as described by the ABCDR project that's Sarah Moore led in Ifukara. You're talking usually attrition, physical integrity, insecticidal efficacy, and so on. And you guys have worked in many countries, and in nearly all of them, the functional survival goes down much faster than expected. And you see this also with your data on the insecticidal efficacy. One beautiful thing also with the work that you guys have done is you've considered many different net types, and the consistency there is it's just amazing. Do you want to talk more about this, or sorry for disrupting your train of thought here? No,
that's fine. So I mean, the last two graphs are from a paper that uses PMI data from some of the original PMI durability monitoring that Olivier Brier put together with a lot of intensive data analysis. So yeah, and I think Amelia Bertozzi-Vila's paper also shows that nets are not lasting the assumed 3 years on average that we intend them to. There is a lot of variability across settings and products in that. And that makes it difficult to plan the replacement cycles for the nets. And I think that comes into where Marcy was talking about, like dealing with the 2-year campaigns.
But if you just check this data, sorry again to interrupt you a second time, but this is work from this slide from your work with Amelia again. The difference between the country here and here down, those are not small. Is it something that is explainable?
So,
I mean, they are buying the same nets, no?
They are buying the same nets. This is retention times as measured in survey data via coverage. So it's essentially interpolating, solving for a median retention time in a model that estimates coverage from net inputs, taking into account durability. So, I think this is indicative of what we are seeing across different countries. This data has to be considered together with local durability monitoring from each of those countries. These are across a number of different surveys over time. So, interpreting these results, I think there's just overall a picture that we would like nets to last longer than they are currently observed to be lasting. And what are the options for doing that? One is to work on the net product themselves. The other is to try and figure out ways to have people take care of them better so that they are retained longer and they're, you know, in use longer, in better condition. And the third would just be to put more nets in, understanding that they're going to wear out on a different scale than, or a different frequency than what we have been assuming in the past.
Wow. But still, I mean, it's like 2-year difference there, for example. I don't know which country this is at the bottom. And then you
South
have,
Sudan, I think.
and then you have at the top there, you have countries like Gabon.
Yeah, I mean, the red countries are where there's only one survey. So, you know,
Okay.
in that, only Cameroon has multiple surveys above 3 years. So,
Right.
but yeah, I mean, nets
Shame.
move around as well.
Yeah.
And there may be some of that going on in some of this data because, again, it's survey data. We're not measuring cohort of nets over time. So I think that has to be taken into account as well.
Okay. Yeah, Shera?
Yeah, Fred, I note that Dr. Sarah Moore is on the line. Perhaps if she could share her thoughts on this as well. Sarah?
Hi, I'm walking my dogs on the beach. I can't talk, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Sarah. Fred, please go ahead.
That's thank you, Sarah, for that. So anyway, I guess I'm throwing this back to you, Shera.
Oh yeah. Perhaps to Josh, Hannah, and Mercy, all of you, looking at this, is the misuse of bed nets real? Has this been quantified? And does it have an impact that has been quantified on the access and coverage?
So, I mean, I see we're at time here, so we'll try to be brief on this tricky issue. There are opportunities to quantify misuse. In durability monitoring data, there are questions that are asked about, you know, if the net is no longer there, why not? And what has happened to it? Is it being, you know, what are the options? Has it been used for something else? Those questions can also be asked in other survey data as well. They're typically not, however. So it can be difficult to quantify the extent of ITN misuse. We define ITN misuse as, you know, using nets for fishing, as you're seeing here, or other use of, you know, new nets that could be used for protection for something else. If it's an old net and it's served its life purpose and it's worn out and torn, now it's being used for something else, that's what we call repurposing. That's not misuse. The family has just decided now to repurpose it for something useful that's no longer good for protection. There are a lot of observations. There are a number of papers describing misuse of ITNs for fishing. These are based on a lot of anecdotal reports. And if you put enough anecdotes together, then, you know, yes, that's data. Is it quantifiable? It doesn't have a denominator. So, you know, it makes it difficult to interpret. There are clearly areas in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere where use of mosquito nets for fishing is a big problem. That's, you know, not disputable. And there have been steps taken to try and mitigate that, either by providing a net that's less attractive for fishing with, based on the textile, or working with communities to try and find alternative netting material or sanctions and other things. It's a problem. It's not a problem everywhere. From what we can determine, it's focused in particular areas, but it is something that we need to be mindful of in the places where it's happening and work to try and prevent this. Because obviously these nets are being used for fishing because people are valuing or need to eat more than they need to be protected from malaria, or they have other nets that they can use for protection. Again, we need to kind of meet people where they are and understand the motivations and the barriers that they're facing and the constraints that they're facing and the survival, you know, that they need to consider. And there, yeah, I think there's a lot we could say on this, but we're
no, this is this is great. So thank you so much, Anna, and thanks everyone. We still have two questions we wanted to ask. I know that our time is gone very fast. We will probably skip one of them, but very quickly, I just want to have a quick look. We're going to talk about the private sector. We've seen a lot of involvement on the medicine side, and in Tanzania, we even have a net manufacturer that is very active. So there's a lot of investment there. Anna, you and colleagues have done some work really nice from Ghana, suggesting that, you know, in some scenarios, the private sector could help us, you know, reduce by up to 40% the investment that we are putting in for mass distribution. So I'm just listing all this for a general comment for the sake of time. We have a nice publication that has been accepted by a colleague of mine on Twitter, accepted to share this. It's not published yet, but suggesting that when you have stockouts for health commodities in the private sector, in the public sector, you know, this kind of, there's a relationship with how the private sector operates. So you can see there, they find that stockouts increase the private sector anti-malarial prices. So kind of monitoring this. Our questions here are, you know, how do we incentivize the private sector to play a bigger role in malaria control without them taking advantage of this, such as what you see being documented here. I think this is with data from Uganda, if not DRC, I think Uganda, where, you know, when there's a stock out in the public sector, the price goes up in the private sector. But also in Tanzania, you see systems such as the private sector playing a big role in ensuring access to essential medicines and also manufacturing bed nets. So that's one thing that I wanted us to have a look at. We'll come back to that and Anna can talk about it. The other thing that we wanted to look at before Marcy, I know Marcy is about to log out, is the multiple types of net distribution. Throughout the masterclass, we had talks about vouchers. TNVS is a famous example in Tanzania. Mass campaigns, I don't know the official name for that, school distribution, antenatal clinics, or combinations of all this, and just figuring out which one of these is actually the best. We have some work that is related to what Josh was saying earlier, and actually related very much to Josh's own work on why removing the financial barriers increases access and also equity. And this is some of the earliest works done by Professor Absalan Noor that shows here that the moment you introduce free distribution, you kind of are better able to cover the poorest quintals. So I think this is very much in line with what Josh was saying earlier, and it would be nice to have a comment on that. And you know, you guys, particularly Josh and Anna, you've worked a lot on what is then the best option to scale these nets up. In this specific case, you are analyzing and recommending options, and then in Josh's own work, focusing on school net distribution as a way to sustain the game. From some of the conversations we've had, it appears that you're not really decided on just one of them. You're kind of looking at a mix of strategies. It would be nice to hear from you guys, but first of all, from Marcy before she logs off, on what really is the best strategy here to sustain not just coverage, but also access and use of nets. So I think I just wanted to highlight all those multiple things, and then you guys can respond to them before we come towards the end of the masterclass. So we start with Marcy.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I'm really just going to hand this to Hannah. I mean, we've been discussing some of these combinations and quantification issues now for, I don't know, Hannah, 10 years, probably longer. And under a current project that we're working on together, there is some element of looking at this quantification and right mix and how do you use that, and building off of Amelia's paper. So that's work actually that Hannah is working on right now. So I'll hand over to her directly because she's got a paper coming out hopefully soon that will be very exciting for everyone.
Yeah, I have to put the full draft together first, so don't hold your breath. Yeah, I mean, I think we talk about what's the best thing. And, you know, there frequently is no clear best option. I think what we've tried to show in the work on continuous distribution through school distribution, community distribution as well in Madagascar, Zanzibar, South Sudan pilots, has been that there are different ways to deliver nets and that they can be successful. Josh and his team did some really great work on the costing of the different channels and the comparative costs of those different channels and the choices that you might want to make with those incremental cost effectiveness ratios. There wasn't a clear best, right? Like if you're putting out enough nets, whether it's through mass campaigns or through a large scale school program or community-based program, as long as that channel is operating well and not super inefficiently, you're getting nets into communities and they're being used and you can have an impact on malaria. So I think what we're trying to show and make easier is, and thinking about now, particularly in the context of the durability work that we just reviewed a little bit, what is most efficient operationally to get enough nets out there on a basis where people are not going, 3 years without a net. Tanzania's mass campaign schedule has been every 5 years because of delays. And that was never the way that they wanted to operate it. And it's not atypical in many countries to have delays in your campaign. But if you have nets that aren't lasting even 3 years, if your campaign cycle is on a 5-year schedule, it's not going to work very well. So, this paper, 2011 work where Josh and I met in Tanzania and went around with, NMCP and the district officials to kind of assess whether school-based distribution program could be effective. I think over the last 8 or 9 years of that, for eight years of that program, it has been really successful at maintaining ITN access at or near target levels in most of the districts in Tanzania where it's been implemented. We have a lot to learn still about what the best quantification approach is for those school-based distributions once they're up and running, whether or not we are concentrating nets in specific households to the detriment of other households that don't have school children in them. And Tanzania is now starting to implement some channels to target additional households under different criteria to try and spread those nets a little bit better. Maybe Josh will probably want to comment on this as well, but I think on the private sector, this is and sustainability, the nets aren't free. Somebody's going to have to pay for them eventually, whether that's the donor or the national government or the consumer with their own money. Maybe that's sustainable from a donor perspective if we shift all the costs to the consumer, but I'm less convinced that we can just hand over that responsibility and still get equitable coverage. I think this paper from Ghana, I wasn't part of this program specifically, but this was meant to identify niche markets for nets at the higher wealth quintiles that had, special attributes, these nice openings or a zipper or something that was more convenient, didn't have to be nailed into the wall because people were renting. Those markets are out there. Whether or not that juice is worth the squeeze and investment from the suppliers to set up a whole retail division and supply chain and networks of wholesalers and distributors, those are decisions that manufacturers have clearly decided not to pursue in recent years. And we're doing some work in Tanzania at the moment assessing the retail market, and to be honest, we're not finding any very few, maybe like 2 or 3 examples of ITNs specifically that are for sale that aren't that were intended for retail sale. Retail sales of ITNs are I think a hard sell, no pun intended, at this point, because we do have other ITNs being leaked from various countries and appearing in other markets. Not a lot of those, frankly, in our study findings, but of course they are there. And then we have untreated nets that are also filling gaps in households that need additional nets, and sales of those are far outweigh sales of any ITNs. at least from our recent work.
Yeah, Josh, did you want to talk about, thanks a lot, Anna, for that. One question we've always had is whether this private sector is being disincentivized by the existing systems, or if it just doesn't exist because that market is too small. But anyway, thanks for your comments.
Yeah.
Josh, you can comment on that, but also on the distribution problems.
I think, there's a wide variety of things that are going on here. So I think one of the things that's the big takeaway is that we can't ignore the private sector and what their incentives are at every level that matters in there, whether we're talking about incentives for development of new products, that we have these sort of MMV and medicines and IVCC for vector control as public-private partnerships that help to do that stuff, but to also directly to the stuff I see is going on in the chat, the discussions about how we're incentivizing and disincentivizing manufacturers to focus on durability of nets or ignore durability of nets, or sort of race to the bottom, that level, but also to the sort of consumer and retail side of it. And it's in every part of malaria control, whether it's treatment with drugs, whether it's vector control or other pieces. We used to see all these studies at the beginning of net distribution that would show we ought to be able to sell nets to people because they already spend so much on Raid or Doom or whatever insecticide spray product that you think of, or other kinds of insect control things in the retail sector, that if you could just convince people that actually a bed net would work and prevent malaria and kill mosquitoes, they would immediately sensibly switch over to these things. And of course, not all those things are true, but I think it's there. It's a part of all these tools. Bed nets are probably, in some places, yes. I mean, if you're competing against a free product, it can be hard to do for a retailer to sell it. So I'm sure there's some, interference in the market that way. Although, like Hannah's experiment and other things have shown, people are willing to pay at least a little bit for things that they want more, assuming they have the money. And you're just kind of in a I feel like it's a really nuanced question about everything, all these particular issues. And you're going to be again back at this, like, there's very local answers for some of these things, but we have to then go back and really look at the bigger picture questions about how we're either incentivizing or what we're incentivizing, the big picture manufacturing side and supply side and research sides of things, especially in the net place, because it's a very odd market now. And there's a lot of financial incentives working sometimes against what we want in malaria control.
Yeah. And any comments on the distribution methods?
I think
especially regarding your work on the school net program.
I think, Hannah, one of the things that I'm most pleased about in my career is how reasonably successful that school net project has been, and the small part of the role in sort of developing that idea and monitoring over time. And, it seems this discussion about school children and their role in malaria as we get things scaled up, it's also like sort of prescient and seems to fit into there. I think, WHO now recommends mixing continuous strategies with mass campaigns. And I think that's probably the right big picture, guidance on this thing. And I think it's an issue that, again, we start to come back to what's the right mix is going to be a more local question. It may be not a village, level question, or a district level question, but certainly a country level. In Tanzania, we were lucky to have a school system that had relatively high enrollment compared to other sub-Saharan African countries that we looked at. So that was one big factor in sort of advocating that as a channel there, was to say, look, actually, we think we can get to a lot of households reasonably equitable this way. In places that don't have high enrollment in school or have really inequitable enrollment in school, especially at the, at elementary, primary school kind of and levels, it may not be a very good choice of an approach still. And, we want countries to improve that educational attainment and other things too, but it's not going to be, we can't fix that with distributing bed nets at school. That's a bigger education system question. So I think a lot of these things, we really are in a place, and this is something I think I remember Kevin Marsh saying it at some point, where we sort of solved a lot of the easy problems in malaria. and a lot of the problems that we now are looking at, they've become increasingly complex. They're more local mixes of solutions are necessary. We need to start differentiating net products. We can't treat it just like an insecticide treated net is an insecticide treated net. They last different amounts of times. We have now different active ingredients with them. The drugs is the same, is very much getting to be a similar space with the, documentation now of artemisinin resistance in sub-Saharan Africa that's clearly going on. So, it's a much more complicated problem. We're going to need much more local solutions, which I think means we need more capacity to do these studies from people who are also there all the time too. So that's another takeaway.
Thank you so much. I guess an important question is what happens next, and we obviously we have, as always, Sheila and myself, tons of questions. We never get to finish all of them. And for that reason, I would like us to draw towards a close. But while we do that, before we do that, I just want to bring us all back to the issue that yes, some progress is being made. Unfortunately, I feel like we still have a little bit too many deaths as unnecessarily. So for everybody on the call, whatever it is that we can do to achieve that, to be great, to move towards that. So I want to hand this back over to Sheila, but really focus on this message that malaria is still, even though, as Josh is saying, the easy problems have been addressed. Now we have to deal with the difficult problems. It's really, really important for us to pay close attention to what we can get from the lessons learned, and we always every Thursday, have a lot of fun and learn a lot during these master classes. And we're just trying to figure out how can we use this information to, continue in the mission of improving people's health and well-being. So again, just to refocus people's minds on how big the problem of malaria is. Back to you, Sheila.
Yeah, thank you, Fredros. Since we only have, we are out of time. Josh and Hannah, perhaps your final thoughts, and if you're able, you could also share with us, some inspirational information with regards to mentorship, how mentors have shaped your career up to where you are now. But maybe just also focus on the topic of discussion today. Last words. We can start with you, Hannah.
Sure, thanks. I've been really privileged in my career to have great mentors, Christian Lengler and Albert Killian and Matt Lynch, and a lot of the people who are on the call today or have been on the call. And I don't know that I have too many inspirational words. I think everybody here brings a spirit of curiosity to their work, and keeping that curiosity and asking the tough questions and checking assumptions, and taking into account the context that everybody's living in is just really important. So maybe I'll leave it there and hand over to Josh.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you, Fredros and Sheila too, for having us on, and everybody who's sat on this long and listened and over time. And I don't want to keep you too much longer. I guess, to start with mentorship, I guess, just in terms of words for advice, I think one is, there's a lot of people out there. Sometimes you'll know him for a long time, sometimes for a very short time, sometimes intensely or not. But I feel like I've been lucky to have more mentors than I can count. Some of them are really close in supervision, but some of them, were people that I knew for very short times, and something that they did inspired me and led me to think about a way to approach my career, to be, involved in it. Like I met Brian Sharp in South Africa, who was a big part of that program just in the last, year or two of his life, and maybe spent just a couple of weeks around the MRC there. And yet I was so inspired by the way he approached, malaria control and research, and the way he thought, that I think I still go back to thinking about him as a mentor in this way, even though it was a very, limited interaction. And then I have others who I've known for 30 years that people I continue to go back to when I need advice and are always there. So that you'll find them all over the place, I guess, in mentorship, and you need them. It's pure luck of running into a lot of these people that have led me to this specific place in my career that I am. And then broader on this, topic, I think it comes back to just the thing is, somebody said it about vaccinations, but it's not, that it's not vaccines that save lives, it's vaccinations. And I think that's true with all these things too. And the big picture of what a lot of the work that I've done and Hannah's done and, Marcy has done, probably, what you described as my life's work has been about understanding how to turn bed nets into people sleeping under bed nets at a big scale in some way. And by that sort of save lives from malaria. And I think we always need to remember that no matter what we do or develop or what we tweak on the tool end, we've got to get it into houses. We've got to get it to people and make sure that people are using things. That's the most important goal.
Yeah, thank you very much. Fred, do you have anything or should we close?
I'm wondering whether Marcy is still on the line.
No, Marcy left.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, for me, really just to say a big thank you again to Josh and to Anna and to Marcy. As I said in the beginning, we had a little challenge this time sending out the information. We're trying to figure out the best way to send out notifications. So we had a lot less people joining the call today, but hopefully we will address this problem going forward. Our next masterclass comes next week. It will be by Chris Druckley and Tune Bozema, and we will send out the announcement today. But thank you guys for giving us company and for staying with us through this time. This is a long conversation, Anna and Josh. It's tough to speak for 3 hours. You almost did 3 hours actually. So you're going to need a lot of water.
That's okay. I have 3 more hours of class to teach today after this, so it'll be fun.
Oh man, yeah. But as always, thank you guys so much, and we look forward to joining with you guys again in future classes if possible. This has been incredible. This class has been streamed live on YouTube, and it will remain available on our YouTube channel for people who are not able to join it today. So again, thank you. And back to you, Sheila. I just want to say also a big thank you to Sheila, my colleague, the co-host with whom we have run now 32 sessions of this class, and with whom I hope we will run many more. Back to you, Sheila.
Well, thank you, Fred. Well, thank you, Fred. It's an honor to be a part of these masterclasses. I want to give a big thank you to our speakers today, Hannah, Marcy, and Joshua. Thank you very much for sharing your opinions and your expertise very kindly. And to our participants, as usual, you keep our chats, the chat boxes very engaging. We thank you for joining, and we hope that you will be with us again next week with another exciting masterclass. So bye to everyone.